Graphics, thank you. So, what is this about? Why am I doing this research, and what's the point? Well, all of you in here are musicians and are trying to come to grips with this really interesting and evocative instrument. And the instrument, it was Anne Heyman in her book, The Secrets of the Gallic Harp, who said, your instrument is your best teacher, or words close to that. And that is so true. We have so much to learn from the surviving instruments. They are just a treasure chest of information on not only how the harps were built, but how they were played. And that's really at the core of what I'm doing, is trying to find out as much as we can from the surviving harps. And every little thing is a clue, even a little scratch is a clue. So it really is forensics in every sense of the word. But the harps, in a sense, they're a bit of a mystery. They're like this black cutout. We know the shape of it, but really, we need to fill in, what's inside. So it's a bit of a question mark. We know more than we did 100 years ago, but there's so much more to find out, and that's what I am doing is about. So how do we go about this? How do we find out more? We really have to think. Yes, it's a little bit cheesy, but you really do have to think like a detective. I'm a big fan of Sherlock Holmes, and he was always, I did my little study on cigarette ashes, and I can identify this particular cigarette and when the ashes were dropped, and I know who the murderer was. That sort of thing. It's every tiny little thing is a piece of the puzzle. It may by itself look insignificant, but actually if you say, oh, that's interesting, oh, this is interesting, and it becomes like a jigsaw puzzle. You've got a little bit of the sky here, you've got a bit of grass over there and some water, and you start putting this together and this together, and you say, ooh, that connects to that, and all of a sudden there's a picture there. You go, oh. Whereas before all you had was a blue piece and a green piece, and you had no idea what they meant and how they fit together. So that's what this is about. Now, the appetizer. Okay. This is the Trinity College harp at Trinity College Dublin, also known as the Brian Boru harp. And those of you who are going on the field trip on Tuesday will have the opportunity to see this in the long room. And it's very exciting to see. One of the oldest surviving early Irish harps. The three oldest, well, I can't say oldest because we don't know, but the three that we believe are the oldest survivors are this one and the two that I just mentioned. Now, I'm hoping at some point in the not too distant future to study this instrument. It hasn't happened yet. You won't be, sorry to disappoint, but something to look forward to. However, I do have something for you. Now, this is what the harp looks like right now, and that's what you'll see when you go see it on Tuesday. But it didn't always look like this. This is what it looked like in the 19th century, actually up until 1961. In 1961, the harp underwent conservation, and it was changed considerably. You see, this is now gone, and some other work was done to it. So it didn't always look like it looks today. You're not seeing it in its pristine condition. It's undergone changes, but that's not unusual. Musical instruments change over time, even during their working lives. That's sort of the story of historical musical instruments, is you're not getting something just as it left the worker's hands. You're getting something that's undergone a series of changes over time. And when one studies an old musical instrument, often it's like peeling back the layers of an onion. You see the instrument as it is now, and you peel back a layer, virtually, and you see how it was maybe at the next step back before someone made some changes, and you peel back another layer, and you see it a further back stage. So this is the Trinity harp up until about 1961. Even before then, this is, and thank you to Simon for actually bringing that photograph that I just showed you to my attention, and also thank you, Simon, for bringing my attention to this early engraving. This is what like the Trinity
Can I just say, I think we've
Yeah.
got an original of this in the library somewhere here.
Cool, okay.
But I don't know where, you have to hunt for it.
All right, here you go. This is what it looked like at the beginning of the 19th century, so 200 years ago. Very different. This was, you know, not attached, so a lot was done to it. And these are important things because this sort of business here determines the size of the frame, how long the strings are, what pitch you're going to have it at, how many strings are on it, you know, their spacing, all sorts of stuff that affects you if you play a replica of this harp. These are things that you are going to want to know, your builder is going to want to know. So this is all interesting stuff. Well, it turns out that in the 1960s, when the Trinity harp was restored to its, or conserved to its current state, this was done at the British Museum, and normally there would be some kind of a report written up about it. There would be records of what was done to the harp, and there was sort of this hints that there was something around, but maybe the records were mislaid, or they were kind of missing in action. There were a few pieces, a few pages that had kind of been circulating around, and I'd seen a couple of pages, thanks to Simon, and I thought, ooh, this is really tantalizing, but where's the conservation report? Anytime a museum artifact is conserved, there's a conservation report. And it was MIA. Nobody knew where it was. And the reason, you know, there were tantalizing hints that there was interesting information in there that could tell us about this harp. Well, last year I contacted the British Museum, and I contacted someone in the conservation department, just, you know, on the off chance, do you have anything? And she said, yeah, do you want a copy? And I said, yeah, send it to me. So she did. So I've got the conservation report for the Trinity College harp from 1961. And I'm going to talk to you about that a little bit. This is just the cover. But there's all sorts of interesting things in here, and I'll mention a few of them. So, first of all, one interesting thing that they did, and I'll read this for you because I don't know if you can read the handwriting from back there. Harp dismantled after X-raying. That's very exciting. Old repairs and makeup removed. New repairs made with Bond filler and reconstructed to conform to different shape as being more correct. Harp strung and played. Recording made by BBC. So inside this report there are I think there are 4 pages of photographs. Unfortunately, all I have is a PDF file, so I don't have the photographs at full resolution, but I have them at pretty good resolution. This is really nice because it shows this is what the harp looked like on all sides before they made any changes to it. And there's a couple of interesting things. This is really interesting. You get a little peek inside. We don't have any photographs of the inside of this harp, and we really don't have a lot of photographs of the harp itself. So this is really cool. What's going on in here? There's something in there. And again, it's nice to have these photographs pre-1960s conservation. Because there's a lot, as I said when I started the talk, everything is a clue. And there's a lot of information on here that is maybe been changed or obscured by conservation work. So it's really nice to see what the instrument was like prior to the most recent changes to it. And here's a closer-up picture. So there's actually, a post has been put inside the harp sound box, and it's screwed into the back cover. That's not original to the instrument. That's something that must have been done probably in the 19th century, because the instrument underwent conservation in the middle of the 19th century, and that's probably when this dates to.
Karen,
Yes,
isn't that a photo from after this?
it is. Thank you for pointing that out. They hadn't done this. They
Oh,
had fixed up the front, and they had done this. If I go back one, two, here it is before they did anything
oh,
to it.
yes.
Yeah, so they were partially done. But that photo just happens to show close up. Okay, this is a wonderful photograph, and let me explain what this is about. Before I get to that, I had to say one more thing about the conservation work. This is what the conservator had to say. Removal of back and removal of putty in areas shows that putty covers wood. Brass collar loosened, glue reversed from this area and also from the top crosspiece. And in old photographs of the Trinity College harp, there's a brass collar around the joint where the neck goes into the sound box. And you can't see that now. It's either been removed or covered up. Now there's just this whole shoulder of putty so that we can't see. That joint is obscured. And if you're an instrument builder, you really want to know what the joinery is like if you want to build a replica of this instrument. And that's obscured by putty right now. And here we have a clue that they loosened that. Did they remove it? Did they take it off and it's gone? Was the wood rotten underneath? We don't know. But this is a piece of information that at least we didn't have before. There was one thing I wanted to say from in here. I don't want to read this whole thing to you because it's too long. Except to say that there's a lot of interesting commentary in here from the person who actually took the harp apart and worked on it. And so the information in here, the observations in here are like gold dust. We don't have a lot of photographs. We really wish that the conservators had taken photographs when they had the harp in pieces. That would be fantastic. We don't have that, but at least we have their notes and some of the comments that they had to say, you know, after they dismantled it. The four separate sections, sound box, four pillar, and cross pillar, and baseboard, carefully cleaned up by picking out foreign matter and old adhesive with small chisels and orange sticks. The sound box was badly split, so was clamped level and secured with araldite. And wherever possible, araldite F was injected into the worm tunnels to consolidate the very porous and fibrous wood. So this is a harp that was really very, very deteriorated state when they got it in 1961. Bondafiller resin and fiberglass were used to reinforce the splits from underneath. So inside the sound box, there's a lot of fiberglass right now. Edges of the sound box were also made up, enabling the baseboard, that's the back cover, of the sound box to press home securely. And there's more in there, and I won't go into it right now. But except to say this is really kind of fun. After careful visual examination, the harp was photographed to provide a record of its condition and X-ray to locate screws, nails, etc. used as fastenings. The harp was then dismantled, the metal portions removed for cleaning, and all materials such as nails, pins, screws, cardboard, canvas, and glue removed as far as possible for examination. So this is what was inside the Trinity College harp when they found it. These were found to be modern in date, generally later than 1850. Large amounts of putty had been used to fill cracks. Much putty had been smeared over the wood, often obscuring ornament, and all this was removed. They also go on to say the wood of the harp, which was identified as willow, was riddled with wormholes and decayed in places. They don't say anything about how they did the wood identification, so I don't know if that was just them looking at the wood or if they did a microscopic identification. Okay, this photograph is fantastic. This is Mary Rowland, and she actually played the Trinity College harp in the 1960s after it was conserved. They decided, and this is not something that we would do today, but back in the 60s, the criteria were different. They decided at the British Museum that once they had conserved this harp, that it was strong enough that it could be strung up and played, and it was. And the picture on the left is Mary Rowland holding the harp with her hands in the most comfortable position for playing that instrument based on where the wear marks were on the sides of the sound box. And on the right-hand side, she's demonstrating how one would hold a lever harp to play that instrument. And you can see the difference in the position of her hands. So she says, on the left, the caption is details showing the position of the hands in the way the harp was played. This was proved by the wear marks made by the arms on the sound box. And on the right, details showing the position of the hands is used on present-day harps. And I just wanted to read you a little bit of this. This was in the conservation report. It was written by Mary Rowland. Now this sheet I've seen before. It was circulating around, so some of you may have heard this. I won't read the whole thing, but there's part of it that's really quite interesting. The first time this harp was handled by me, it became immediately apparent that the deep wear marks on the sound box gave absolute indication as to the way it was held, i.e. on the left shoulder, with the left hand playing the treble strings and the right hand the bass. This is the reverse order to all modern harps, which are placed on the right shoulder with the right hand playing above the left as a general rule. Skipping down. This is not so with the Trinity College harp, for the depth of the wear marks also indicated that the harp had been held in position on its keel by the arms or wrists while playing, thus giving each hand only a limited range of action. Only in a kneeling position or when sitting on a low stool with the harp standing on the floor was it possible to fit the arms into the wear marks. Both a sitting position with the harp on the knee and a standing position with the harp resting on a table were tried and found impossible. In both these positions, it was subsequently found equally impossible to tune the harp because it was difficult to support it and to find the correct peg to turn at one and the same time. Sitting on a low stool was the best solution, for the harp was then leaning against a chest, supported by one knee and two wrists. I am a big woman, 5 feet 6.5 inches in height, and big boned, so that a playing position comfortable to me will not be far removed from that adopted by the men who played this harp in the past. Few of the aspects of modern harp technique are applicable to the Irish harp when authentically strung. The broad shoulders, the varied string spacing, so close in the lower register that only a fingernail could get in between, and wide and splaying at the top, and the use of long fingernails as plectra all necessitate hand positions, plucking technique, and agility quite different from those required on any other harp. On one lower string, tuned to somewhere near its original pitch, it was possible to play harmonics, even to obtain a nearly complete series. This was done with considerable ease, though the method is more difficult than, and completely different from that used to obtain harmonics on any gut-strung harp. Okay, Simon, how do I turn that on? Yes. And we get to hear it. Thanks, Simon. And that's that. That's Mary Rowland and talking to Joan Rimmer about playing harmonics on the Trinity harp. by harmonics, what is meant is you touch, instead of just plucking the string or striking the string, what you do is you touch the string at a node. In other words, as the string vibrates, you've got a sine wave going for your fundamental frequency, your higher harmonics. And the nodes are where the string is not moving. They're where the wave crosses the motionless part of the string, and you've got a little motionless spot that doesn't vibrate. So part of the string will be doing this and part's doing that, and the node is the in-between point that's not moving. And you touch the string gently at the node, just as you're plucking it, and you can actually make the string sound the higher harmonic. It takes a little bit of a knack to do it, but that's what she was doing there. She goes on to say, the second time I played the harp, the split and subsequent repair of the sound box determined the number of strings available for tuning. When they strung up this harp and played it, as Anna mentioned, they didn't put it at full tension, but however, the sound box split while they were playing it. And they had to re-repair the sound box.
Sorry, Karen, do you have the recording of that?
Bang?
Yeah.
No, I don't.
I think,
Is
do
there
you
one
have
around?
more sound recording than that?
I have what Simon
Yeah, but
has.
I don't have time.
That's not on the recording though. But
Yeah, I
You
can't
think
remember,
there-
it's
you
been
think
a long
there's-
time since I've listened to what I had. I thought I was hearing and they remarked, oh, the crack, but
well, maybe,
But
but
maybe
not
they
on
don't-
that one.
yeah.
Yeah, there might be more out there. So yeah, that would be really interesting to hear.
yeah,
But
maybe I
hear
don't
what they
remember
said.
right.
Yeah, so yeah, they had the harp strung up and they were playing it and they cracked the sound box of the Trinity College harp. And they went back and repaired it and strung it up again. But this time,
I thought it was only strung up once and then it broke, but you're telling me.
they went back, yeah, according to this, yeah, they went back and strung it up again. But what they did was they didn't put all the strings on it, they just put some strings on it and they brought it up to like minimal pitch binaural. The fact that they did it again, I don't know. Yeah, the 10 top strings were tuned contiguously and 4 of the middle strings were tuned to a pair of contiguous fifths. This somewhat arbitrary selection of strings being determined by the condition of the sound box. All the strings were tuned to minimum, not maximum effective tension, and were therefore considerably lower in pitch and duller in tone than would have been the case when the instrument was in perfect playing order. Even so, it had a sound quite distinct from and infinitely superior to any of the so-called Irish harps, which are in fact back formations of the large orchestral harp, her words not mine. Apart from the unfamiliarity of the reversal of the hand positions and the capricious string spacing, the feel of the instrument was alive and natural, and the playing position altogether comfortable. By any standards, the portions of the harp which was tuned maintained its intonation remarkably well, but it was necessary to gear down the pull of the nails on the strings to the low tension. The reason I read this out to you is, well, first of all, it's interesting. It's really, really fascinating to hear her firsthand account of playing the original Trinity College harp. But also, this is what I'm talking about. This is why I do this research. There's so much information in the actual instrument that can inform the way you play your harps and the way you interpret the music. Okay, an X-ray was mentioned. Now, before you get too excited, well, first of all, I'll say, yes, the X-ray was in this packet that I received. So you're going to see an X-ray, but before anybody gets too excited, it's not of the whole harp. I know, let's all go. It's of one joint. It's of this particular part of the harp. And that's kind of interesting. Actually, it's very interesting, and I'll show it to you in a minute. But there's more to this. There's another reason why I'm showing you this photograph here. And one of the conservators and I'm not sure who because I can't read the person's signature very well, but one of the conservators wrote a couple of sheets on the cheek bands. Now the cheek bands are the metal strips on either side of the neck that the tuning pins go through. And this particular person was really interested in why the cheek bands were bowed out and why they were misaligned with some of the tuning pins. And this was this person's sort of train of thought about this, but and that's interesting in itself because they come to the conclusion the only way that that could have happened that they could see is the tuning pins must have been out of the harp for some time and the wood shrank and misaligned. And anyway, there's a whole long argument here and I won't go into detail with that. But there's something in here that they say almost as an aside that's incredibly interesting. And that is, let me see if I can find it. Oh yes. They call the neck the harmonic bow. So when I say harmonic bow, we mean this. We would love to know, one of the curious things is there's this beautiful decorative metal end cap on the end of the Trinity College harp. It would be really interesting to know what's underneath that. There's what appears to be a tuning pin hole that's just got a plug in it that doesn't have a tuning pin in it. Was there a string there and, you know?
There was a pin in that hole in the old photos.
Was there? Okay. So there was a pin in there. It would be really nice to know, gee, what's underneath there? And what's going on with that? Why did they put a cover on the end? Is that original? I don't think that's original. Do you think, Simon?
No.
No. So why? Why is that on there? Just for show? Was there some damage under there? Or did the neck used to be longer and something happened or they decided to change it? It's sort of like, I want to know what's under there. When they took this harp apart, they took off that end cap. Unfortunately, they did not photograph what was underneath. I know. But there's a description. The end of the harmonic bow has been cut off through the last hole for a peg. This one. The hole has clearly not been channeled out of the open end. Such a cut could not have been made in normal fashion by a saw unless the metal strips, the cheek bands, were temporarily removed since they project across the line of cut. So they project beyond the end of the wood where it's been cut, the cheek bands stick out. The surface of the cut has been pared level, so it's been carefully smoothed out, not left a sawn. There are no marks of accidental slips with a chisel on the edges or the insides of the strips, the cheek bands. This also suggests that they've been removed. They were mostly interested in the cheek bands, but this is very, very interesting. So there was a tuning pin hole here that was complete. The neck of the Trinity College harp used to be longer and it was cut. And we now know that that's for sure. We didn't know that before. So that's really interesting. Now for the x-ray, okay. Okay, here's the x-ray. This is the only x-ray of the Trinity College harp that I'm aware of, so that's kind of cool to see. And what are we looking at? So we're looking at the end of the neck. The bright objects are dense things. Things that are metal are white on this image. So here's one cheek band, there's the end of the cheek band. It goes right through, there's a half of a tuning pin hole there. So what's going on there? Was the cheek band cut? Also, this person is saying that extends beyond the wood, so I don't know what's going on there. So was there more, and that was cut off? Because you don't put a half a hole in a cheek band. I don't know. There's some nails were stuck in here. Here's the top end of the forepillar sticking into. There's a mortise and tenon joint here, and it's sticking into that joint, and it's out at an angle. Now this X-ray was taken before they took the harp apart, and if you remember that photograph of I showed you from the 19th century, the harp used to have this sort of ornate kind of doodad on the end of the, that's an official term, on the end of the four pillar. They made the four pillar was much longer than it is in its present state. And so I think in order to do that, they had to change the angle that it comes into this joint. I think that's what's going on here, because it's in this joint at an angle. So this is very interesting to see, and actually one could pore over this for a long time and see more. I'm going to move on, so I've got a lot of other stuff that I want to talk about. Now, the title of this talk said harp forensics, and when we think of forensics, we usually think of a crime, or crime scene investigation. And actually there is a real crime involved here, a bona fide crime. And I'd like to thank Simon for bringing this to my attention a few years ago. At first I thought he was pulling my leg, but no, actually he wasn't. The Trinity College harp was stolen in the 1960s, in 1969. So this is from the New York Times. A sad day for the Irish ancient harp is missing. But someone broke into Trinity College and stole the harp out of its case. March 25th, 1969. This was not, by the way, this was not in the conservation report, but I'm bringing this up because it actually relates to the conservation report in an interesting way, so also it's a fun story. It was recovered on April 19th, so like 3 weeks later, so it was missing for 3 weeks. And let me read I got it for the people that were reading in Latin. For the people in the back row, police said the harp appeared to be slightly damaged. After recovering the relic, detectives raced back to the city to await near a garbage can in which Trinity College officials had been instructed in a ransom note to leave a large sum of money. The detectives closed in at the appointed time and arrested 2 men trying to leave the area in a car. Their names were not disclosed. So in other words, the thieves sent a ransom note and said, leave a big bag of money in this rubbish bin. And not being particularly intelligent thieves, the police just waited next to the rubbish bin for the guys to come and get the money, and then they arrested them, and that was the end of that.
Actually, it was an IRA scheme, and it was trying to get money for political
Really?
reasons.
Oh,
Yeah.
interesting. Oh, I didn't know that. They didn't mention that.
No, maybe they hadn't determined it here, or.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah,
Interesting.
it was Provo money.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Okay. Wow, that's really interesting. I had no idea. Okay. And actually, and here it is, recovered. That's the day they recovered it. That's an AP wire photograph that in fact, thank you, Simon, again, who said, he saw this on eBay. He said, you should buy this.
I love the expressions on the detectives.
Oh, I know.
It was the second guy.
So this is the keeper. I don't know who his name was. That's the keeper, though. And these are the cops in the background looking like cops from the 1960s. It's great. So there it is. But let me back up from it. Actually, the thing I want to bring your attention to, although it was a funny story in the end, I won't believe it worked out okay, but police said the harp appeared to be slightly damaged. Actually, it was a little bit more than slightly damaged, according to the conservation report. And let me just say, so after they got the harp back, they actually sent it back to the British Museum in it was sent actually in 1971, so a couple years later, and it was the same people, the same conservators, so they recognized the signatures, who worked on it again, who had worked on it 10 years previously, which is really interesting because they knew what the harp looked like before. And I'll read out. When the harp was examined, it was noticed that, first of all, it was infested with woodworm, but I don't think that had anything to do with the thieves, so they had to fumigate it. The wooden bear, which had been inserted in the sound box during the restoration carried out in 1961, was found to have broken away from the top of the sound box. So maybe you're right, Simon, maybe that was from 1961. This was centralized and secured with bond of paste and fiberglass. the broken rabbit on which the backboard rests was repaired, and some other small missing sections of the rabbit were made up in Bondo paste. The fragment broken off from the side of the sound box was replaced using Araldite adhesive, and because the sound box had also been split at this point, it was reinforced from the inside with a mixture of fiberglass and Bondo glass adhesive. And they have more to say. So, yeah, slightly damaged, but a little bit more than slightly damaged. And there's a handwritten note. The top section of the rear of the sound box was found to be in a very spongy condition, so it was consolidated with resin and made up to original shape to once again add strength. So yeah, it was a little bit more than slightly damaged. There's an afterword to this. I had no idea about the IRA connection, so that's really interesting. They did arrest the guy and sentenced him. And what I find interesting about this, so Richard Tynan, 23, pleaded guilty today to receiving Ireland's 600-year-old Brian-Marie harp when he knew it was stolen. He was given a 2-year suspended jail sentence. Police said Tynan, a cabinet maker, took charge of the harp after it was stolen in March of last year. So the guy was a cabinet maker. And in fact, I managed to track down someone, I don't know if it's the same Richard Tynan, but someone of the same name who had a furniture shop in Dublin until a few years ago, retired a few years ago. So at any rate, it would be really, really fascinating to know what this cabinet maker made of this instrument that he had with him for 3 weeks. So I found it very, very fascinating. Okay, I'm going to move on, but just to recap, there's a lot more in this conservation report. I'm just giving you little fragments and bits and pieces, and I apologize that it sounds a little fragmented. It's sort of like I'm trying to pick out little nuggets to give you a flavor of what's inside there. It's full of little gems like this, and things like when they did the 1961 conservation of the harp, they had replica tuning pins made. Some of the tuning pins were missing. I don't know. That's something to look at, Simon, when you guys look at the harp. The tuning pins that they had made, I'll have to look in the conservation report. Did they just put in like obviously modern ones, or did they actually make ones that look like the old ones? They also did some electrotype replica string shoes, because there were some string shoes that they replaced with.
I think the tuning pins are not obviously modern, but
okay, some of them are.
Look, if some of them are plain, some of them are decorated.
Yes.
So perhaps they're the plain ones. They didn't say which numbers are.
They don't say which ones. I'll tell you later how many though, and you guys can maybe kind of suss that out. And a couple of the string shoes are also modern copies made to look like old ones. Okay, so that was the appetizer. But now for the fish dish. So these are the two harps I've been researching. And back in 2010, we CT scanned these two harps. It was the first time any of these old harps had ever been CT scanned, and it was really cool. And I showed a bunch of videos and images when I was here, and it was 3D glasses and stuff. We've since had the harps back out of their cases and back in the conservation lab, and we've been doing other materials analysis with them and other visual examination with them. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. This photograph, by the way, is not photoshopped. That's the two harps sitting next to each other. We had them both out at the same time, which was really cool. Unfortunately, I was not able to get all the photographs of them next to each other that I would have liked to have gotten. The reason being, we had a large lab space, and the harps it's sort of like when you've got the car in the shop and it's up on the lift and it has the hood open. They were, in a sense, up on the lift with the hood open, so to speak, being worked on, and not in a state where you could sort of jiggle them around and start taking photographs of them next to each other. But at least I have this. At a future date, I would like to, if we have them both out again, take pictures, more photographs of them, comparative photographs of them end on and side on. I think that would be really good. Family photo. Okay, so here they are, quite different, both early Irish harps, but really different from each other. The Lamont has some pretty obvious damage and repair, and the Queen Mary actually has damage and repair too, just less obvious. The Queen Mary harp is very similar in design to the Trinity College harp that you'll be seeing on Tuesday, and also some of you have replicas of Trinity. How many in here have or are playing this week either a Trinity replica or a Queen Mary replica? Oh, wonderful. Okay, good. Okay. Any Lamont people? No, wait, just me.
Yeah.
Okay, so I CT scanned them. That's what they look like inside. These are renderings from the CT scans. And the metal parts show up as bright on these images. And there's all sorts of interesting hidden repair work inside both of these instruments. And here they are. There's the Queen Mary. And you can see inside through the wood. I made it so that the wood is translucent. Just to recap what I did for, and also it's fun to show these. There's the Lamont. We found hidden straps inside, all sorts of interesting hidden damage and repair inside the neck and the joinery. Okay, so the Queen Mary harp. And again, the CT scanning was able to show us how the harp is put together, the joinery and also the dimensions in terms of real physical measurements, and the damage, hidden damage and hidden repair inside. That helps us not only understand what has happened to the harp, but also you can sort of work backwards and try to figure out, okay, what did this instrument look like when it came out of the maker's hands? We can at least try to approach that. And the joinery is really important to understanding how the frame works and what has happened to it. And damage to the frame is a clue. It's a clue to, you know, how the harp was being used, how heavily it was being strung. Are these things, you know, part of the design? Did somebody come in later and change the string so that the frame couldn't handle it and cause damage? Or, you know, there's all sorts of considerations. Now, the Queen Mary, we were not able to, the first time around, I spoke to the conservation staff at the museum and I said, can we open up the sound box? Can we take the back cover and look inside? And they said, no, the back cover is too fragile. It could cause damage. So I said, okay. So what I did was I took the CT scans and I virtually opened up the back cover. So this is, I virtually sliced out the back cover, and this is a rendering of the inside of the harp from the CT scans. And you can see there's very, very faint sort of lines here. That's actually tool marks on the inside of the sound box. Those are the marks of the person who carved out that sound box using a gouge. And they're very, very even, and they're slightly angled. And I can tell you one thing about this person. I can't tell you what they were wearing that morning or what they had for breakfast, but it was a right-handed person who carved out that sound box based on the angling of those.
Karen, can I ask you, in your opinion, how vertical is the inside, the cut mark at the edge, or does it slant in? Do you see what I mean? Is there more wood on the inside?
You mean the angle between the
Yeah,
front
yeah,
and the
it's the, how close in size is
Well, yeah, point.
this to up here? What kind of angle, how much thicker is it, say, you know, when you get to here?
Oh,
To
does
the
it come,
side.
does it come
Yeah,
right
yeah,
up the
is
edge?
it,
You'll see in a
you
minute.
know, like that?
You'll
Yeah,
see in a
okay.
minute. It's a good question. So anyway, yeah, so here's a close-up. You can see it a little bit better. And, well, this is nice, but we'd really like to see the inside. And when we had the harp back out, I got the CT scans out, and I stood there with the head of conservation, who's also an expert in wood artifacts. And she has the hands of a surgeon. And I brought up the CT scans of this harp, and working alongside her, I guided her to where all of the nails or screws or whatever were. And we were able to tell from the scans that there were no historical nails, or no nails actually at all, holding this on. There were 2 modern brass screws, I think it was two or three modern brass screws holding it on, very short, and that was it. Part of the complication was the back of this harp has this beautiful crenellated shape to the back cover, and we think that this back cover is original. And if it is, that's really amazing, because it's the only one that I know of that's original of those 3 really old harps. So we think this is an original part of the instrument, it's not a replacement. And this is very delicate here, and you can probably make out there's woodworm holes, so it's really fragile, and it's got this delicate shape. And you can understand why they didn't want to pry that off. So we were able to determine exactly how to safely remove it without causing damage. So I'm going to show you the first photographs of the inside of the Queen Mary harp. So there it is. And the tool marks go, these were done with a gouge. And the way it was done is the person would have had to work from the center to the edge. From the center to the edge, because they come right up to the edge. And you'll see in the other photographs, they come right up to that edge. And here they are again. You can see they come right up to the edge. And this is very straight. This is I don't want to say it's a right angle, but very nearly a right angle here. And they come just right up to that edge there. This is really interesting for people who want to build replicas. Now, I have a feeling, I'll show another photograph again, and here's with a scale, so you get an idea of the size of the tool that was used, probably something about, a little bit more than 1/2 centimeter, or maybe about 7 millimeters wide gouge. I have to wonder, these harps don't have any internal ribbing. However, whether it's by design or by accident, these grooves that were left by these grooves that were left by the gouge act like micro ribs, really. So they provide strength, almost like the ribs in a flexible straw. They provide strength while allowing for flexibility. Now, I don't know if that's by design or not, but it's interesting to think about. Especially when you look at the sides. The sides of the soundbox, so here's the inside of the front surface. It's got these grooves in it. The sides have been made and finished perfectly flat. So this makes me think this is not a matter of somebody just roughly carving this out and, well, we'll just roughly carve it out and just leave it as a. The person who did this also did this, and I can say that because from looking at these close up, this does not look like this was done by a later person. This was done at the same time as this by looking at the ends of where the tool went. And we can look at this a little bit closer. Actually, they used a tool, a scraper with a fine serrated edge. So this is all done with a fine serrated edge. And that's really interesting to me. The person who did this. So they had a reason for leaving that way. And so it's something we didn't think about. And as I said, one possibility is, you get strength and flexibility. Literally, it's like micro ribs. And that's really interesting. And if you're a builder also, if you leave this way, what does that do to the acoustics of the soundboard? And so that's something to think about when you're building a replica of one of these harps. Now, one thing we did notice is the bottom end of the soundbox So, I don't wanna mess with Simon's heart, but at the bottom of the sound box, I'll have to.
Yeah, go for it.
It's freshly polished. What is next to
So this picture is of the inside of this, the inside of this surface here, the bottom. That's what I mean by the bottom. And it's really roughly worked. And it's actually, that's not original. Somebody at some point in this instrument past went in and, what did I do in my cover? Went in and removed a couple of millimeters of wood from the bottom end of the sound box. And whoever did it was not the same craftsman who did the original work. The original work was done at a very high level of craftsmanship. The head of conservation, when she saw the inside of this, she said this was a top-notch, highly skilled craftsman who carved out this sound box. The absolute top drawer workmanship. And this bit was done by someone who was not. And it's really kind of crude, and they went in there with a chisel and just hacked away. Let's take out a couple of millimeters out of the bottom. And what they'd done originally, this right here where the sound, what would be the front, the soundboard, meets the bottom, that's it just rolls over there. There's not a sharp corner there. It's nicely carved, so there's just a smooth curve there, so you don't have a right angle here. And the person who hacked that away just hacked into that rolled over edge there. So the person who made this originally made sure that at the bottom you don't have a sharp corner right there. That was changed by the person who hacked it. And at the top end also, it rolls over, it doesn't come into a sharp corner. And here's the top end. So this is what it looks like at the top. This is the neck coming into the sound box. So this harp was made all open inside here. So this is all carved out inside, and it's got an open Morrison tenon joint. It's got a through joint here, and I think that's important to the acoustics of the instrument up at the treble end in particular. I think that helps the instrument at that end to have a better sound, a less woody sound. This is a picture that one doesn't normally see. This is the inside of the back cover. And I thought this was really fascinating. So normally we see the pretty side that shows in the museum. And people have been wondering, is the back cover of this man of Bogwood or what is it, this is the inside. And it's got all this, it's very dark. It's almost black. I'm going to tell you right now, it's not Bogwood though. It's this color because people have spread something on it to kind of consolidate it, and all these sort of interesting, almost organic looking stuff here is actually material that had been spread onto the back, and you can imagine it, someone stood it up on the tips here. Imagine if you're refinishing furniture, and they painted something on it, and it sort of sheeted down like this. This back cover, it was interesting to look at the inside because you can see all the repair work, and that's interesting because there are several layers of repair work. This back cover was repaired multiple times by different people over its history, and to me that suggests it might be original, because if it wasn't, you wouldn't bother. You would just make a new one. It's just a slab of wood. So whoever kept repairing this over the years really wanted to save this. This was important to save. It's riddled with woodworm, there's not much there, but they really wanted to save what was left, which suggests it might actually be original. And the other thing that suggests that it might be original is on the side that faces outward, there's traces of decorative work that matches the decorative work on the sound box, but it doesn't just look like it. It appears to have been done with the same tool and using the same method. So I think that really is original. The decorative work, this is what I was talking about. This is something that this harp has in common with the Trinity harp, and people who make replicas, try to replicate this beautiful decorative work on the sound boxes, and I was able to look at this with good lighting and with magnification. And one thing that people have been curious about is, well, how was it done? How did they do that? How did they do those lines? What tool did they use? I can tell you right now, it was the tool that was used pressed into the wood. I don't think it was cut in.
Stamp, looks like a stamp, a hook.
It kind of does look like it, except, and that's why I thought for me, I thought, well, did they have like a stamp that's stamped in? Although you can see on other parts where well, actually right here, where there's places where they do circles and where it runs over. So, and like here too, they run over the edge. So I'm wondering if it was, a tool that they were doing like compass work, and you go a little bit too far, you overrun. I don't know, but whatever they did use, it's pressed in. It's pressed into the wood. You can see where the wood grain actually dips down. It doesn't show that well on this picture, but the wood grain actually dips down into the decorative lines as if the wood's been pressed downward. Okay, so that's what they did. I don't know if it's burned in or not, if they had like a hot poker or a hot something that they just pushed down into the wood. I couldn't tell. I looked at it under the microscope. There's so many layers of the decorative lines are just packed full of wax and varnish and dirt and junk that I couldn't see underneath to really tell you for sure if it was burned in or not.
Excuse me, Karen.
Yeah.
Can you give some sort of guess at the depth of that? I mean, in the picture, like how far it dips in, or what you give us some sort of suggestion for how deep you think
I
that
would
color
say,
may be?
yeah, it's hard to say. I couldn't even tell you how deep those lines are because they're packed full. So I really would be only estimating, but it's, maybe a couple of millimeters.
Does it show in some of the
What
photos, like the CAT scans?
it shows in the CT scans for a different reason. It shows in the CT scans because what's in those lines is dense, and we analyze what's in the lines. So I'll tell you. I can tell you what's in those lines. Oh, here's a better photograph, so you can see where it dips in. So it was definitely a tool that pushed into the wood. The other thing about this is that one thing that people were wondering about, there are traces of what looks like stain on the front, and I can tell you right now that stain's modern. It's not old. It's on top of whatever's packed into these lines. So that stains from probably no earlier than the middle of the 19th century. Okay, so the lines, yes.
It's a great picture.
Well, thank you. Okay, so we took a sample. What's in those lines? That was one of the things we were wondering. What is in that? What's that black stuff? There's a lot in there. Unfortunately, this stuff gets packed in here, but I can tell you. There's sulfur and lead and flecks of iron and bismuth. And I'll explain the bismuth in a second. There's one other thing which I'll get to in a moment. The bismuth is interesting because bismuth was used in bismuth white, which is a white paint that was used in the early 19th century as a substitute for lead white. And bismuth white is problematic. The reason it's not used today is it pulls sulfur out of the air and it turns black very quickly. It's very unstable. And that's a lot of the reason why those lines are black, is somebody in the early 19th century put bismuth white paint in there, and it took sulfur out of the air and it turned black. And that's what you're seeing. Doesn't mean they weren't black before, but that's the black that you're seeing is from that, almost certainly. Also, the lead could also have been from lead white. That lead white also turns black. There's another thing in there though, there's also flecks of iron, and it wasn't just iron in there, but there were like, we saw little flecks of iron in there, so, and I'm not sure what to make of that, but there was something else in there, the main compound in there was copper. Copper, yes, that's really interesting. I don't know, what I would really like to do is get a better sample. We had a very tiny sample, and it crumbled, so I wasn't able to see the strata, you know, what's on top and what's below and what's below. Ideally, you'd like to be able to see the layers and to see, okay, what was there originally? It's like when you restore an old house and you peel back a paint, you know, flecks of paint, and to see what the original paint was underneath all the different colors. So I'm hoping that I can get permission to take a better sample so that I can actually see different layers. It's quite possible that different things were used at different time periods. This is a very old art. But copper, that's really interesting.
What do you think the copper would imply?
I don't know, Simon. There's, well, all right, I'll say in a minute. Also, well, before I get to that, one aside is, at the top end of this harp, we'll show Simon's again. Unlike the Trinity harp, at the top end of the sound box, there's this palmette, split palmette design that's a different decorative scheme from the rest of the sound box. And you have to it's sort of hiding up there right underneath where the neck joins the sound box. And that, I looked at that with the microscope, and it's done with a different tool than the rest of the sound box with decorative work. So that's something to think about. Was it done at a different time? Or was it just the original person decided to do that differently and use a different tool for a different purpose? It could have been either, but that's something to think about. It definitely was done with a different tool.
Did you compare those tool marks with the ones on the pillar?
Not yet. I have to look at that. Yeah, I don't know. I'd like to be able to say, yeah, I did, and give you an answer, but I don't know.
There are some techniques when you burn in the wood. First you put like a powder or dust, a special mixture on top
Okay.
of the wood, that you have a nicer shape, you know, that it burns more equal in the wood.
Ah.
So I
So
would.
do you think, and what is the powder usually made out of, do you know?
Oh.
Wow.
Yeah,
So
I
maybe,
mean, that was not one possibility.
no,
Actually,
oh, I like that. Oh, that's a
I
good
will try.
possibility.
If I talk to some persons in Austria back there, and I will find out.
Oh, yeah, I like that.
Because you put the powder nicely in the wood, maybe, and then you put the stamp on.
I like that, and it
Yes,
probably
you didn't
distributes
put
the
it
heat more.
directly, so that's why it really looks perfect. And the overlay is because you have a certain set of these stamps, and if they don't fit properly, that's it. I mean,
Yeah, sure. Oh, I like that. Yeah, that makes sense because it would distribute the heat more evenly and you would get a nice.
Yeah.
Made of copper. They'll probably be made of copper being heated up in a house that's
Yeah.
and the
that's been
lead
working
from
Yeah.
the powder, you know.
Yeah, I like that. That's great. Okay, that works for me. Okay, speaking of copper. Oh, can I pick up your harp again, Simon?
Hmm.
I can hold this one. That was a good one. Okay, on the fourth pillar, there are these roundels, and that's one of them. And you can see that the wood looks like it's got some stain on it. It's not all just bare wood. We did do some analysis of that stain last time, but it wasn't easy to get good analysis. All I can say right now is that the darker areas of wood have a slightly elevated level of iron in them. So it could have been a pigment that contained iron. This is definitely painted on. This isn't marquetry, and it's not by accident. You can actually see under magnification where they were painting and where they kind of went over the lines. But what interested me here is when we looked at this under magnification with good lighting, there's actually green pigment inside the lines, in these lines and in these lines. So all the outline of the decorative work there's traces of green pigment inside there. I'm using the word pigment a little bit loosely. There's traces of green in there. Whether it's pigment or not is, that's a question, but I'm pretty sure, I think it is pigment. There's no, one could say, oh, well, were there like brass tacks near there and maybe there's some corrosion that's gotten into the lines. There's no nails or anything brass near here that would get stuff in there accidentally. So I don't think that's in there accidentally. I'll show you. Here's a close-up of what I mean. There's just little traces left in places, and a lot of it is just this is sort of covered up with other stuff. A lot of it's missing. But it's stuck down in here. It's right down at the bottom layer, so I think it's either original or really early. And we analyzed that. And it does contain copper. The green is most certainly copper. We need to do some more analysis because it's also got carbon and other stuff in there. I think a lot of that's dirt. So, we've got to do a little bit more work with it. But the possibility is very strong that this roundel, these little decorative dots around the edge, that was all edged out in green, quite possibly verdigris. So imagine verdigris pigment, which would have been in use for a long time, people had it. All of this tricked out in green edging. I don't know what this color would have been yet. I'm hoping we can find out what the background would have been, but outline was very, very possibly green. All of this outline was green. All those lines. Another really cool thing about this 4-pillar, okay, it's got a different decorative scheme from the neck and the sound box, and that's something we've known about. When I looked at the CT scans, I keep looking at them again and again. This is a picture of that bottom joint. This is the 4-pillar. This is the sound box. This is where they join. It's really not, it doesn't fit properly, but I found, and that's something that we noticed when we first looked at the CAT scans, but I found something else when I looked at them again. There's a shim inside there. It's like a scrap of something, and it's way deep inside, and it's glued to the inside of the mortise joint, the cutout hole. And it doesn't quite, it's not quite stuck to the tenon, it's glued to the wall. The tenon is much narrower than that opening that it's slotted into. And more so than you would get from just wood shrinkage. It's actually quite narrow. And yet, there's this little strip of something that's not attached to it. It's attached to the side. At some point, somebody decided to shim that. And in order to do that, you've got to have the 4-pillar off. I'm beginning to think that, it's quite probable that this 4-pillar is not the original 4-pillar of this boat. That at some point, the 4-pillar was replaced just by the way it fits into the joints. Somebody had to put a shim in here. Somebody had to put a shim in here. There are little tantalizing pieces of information. The top end is a bit odd. So we need to be thinking, we shouldn't assume that all parts of these harps are original. If they were, that would be absolutely unusual. That would be spectacularly singular for an historical musical instrument. I was just down at Oxford a couple of weeks ago looking at the Messiah violin, Stradivarius violin at the Ashmolean. And it's like the most famous Stradivarius in the world. The reason it's so famous and special is because, unlike pretty much all the others, it's in almost its original state, or essentially its original state. Violins, they've got, the neck gets replaced, the tailpiece gets replaced, everything gets replaced, that's normal for an old musical instrument. Stuff gets replaced and changed over time. So it would be very singular if no parts had been replaced on any of these harps. So I'm beginning to suspect very, very strongly, based on this and other evidence, that that four pillar on the Queen Mary harp is not original to the instrument. That's a replacement. And that's really interesting because the decorative work on the four pillar, here's the Queen Mary harp, is very, very close to this. This is on Iona. This is a detail of what's left of a cross, would have been a high cross on Iona. And this is nice because this cross has an inscription on it from when it was made. So we know it was made in 1489. And the decorative work, the rest of the decorative work on the four pillar is consistent with West Highlands art, Iona School of West Highlands art from the second half of the 15th century. So either someone made a really good late copy, copying this decorative design, or the four pillar of this harp is from the second half of the 15th century. And I suspect that it probably is from the second half of the 15th century.
Karen, perhaps you should just trace the leaves, just point out which are exactly the same.
Okay,
one.
so here, so do you see this leaf here? So we're looking at this circle here, and it's got four leaves inside with these lovely little lobes on them, and then this sort of four-petaled flower type thing inside. And we go over here, there's the four-petaled flower, and there are the leaves with the lobes done in very, very similar design. This is a very distinctive pattern.
3, 6, 9, 12, so 4 and then 4 groups of 3.
Yeah. So it's very interesting to see this. This is quite distinctive, and to see it here as well. And the Iona School of West Highland Art has distinctive styles. It's stylistically very distinct, and that's what this harp is from that school. And it's looking like, at least based on the decorative work, that if this four pillar is old, then it's from the second half of the 15th century. In which case, and also it's from this part of the world. It's from the Iona or that area.
And what's the basis for that wonderfully precise dating of the cross?
It was inscribed when it was made by the person who commissioned it, which was Abbot McKinnon, and he had it made in memory of I think his father, and so he had the date added onto it when it was made. So that's why we know. Okay, so if the four pillar is that old, and if it's a replacement, that begs the question: how old is the rest of the harp? Older, but how much older? And I don't have an answer for you today, but let's be thinking about it. Keep that in the back of your mind. How old is the rest of the harp? And I apologize for just touching upon some of the evidence. There's actually a lot more evidence that we've been working with the four pillar, with the CT scans, with the decorative work, with the evidence for damage and possible repair and possible replacement work that really strongly suggests that four pillar is a replacement, and also that it's from the second half of the 15th century. But something else to talk about, and that's wire fragments. Now, the string for your harps, it works for your instruments, for your replicas, but strings are ephemeral on old musical instruments. They're the thing that disappears, and you have to guesstimate. Well, how were the instruments strung? What were the gauges used? What were the materials used? Well, I'm about to tell you some of that information because we found some wire fragment. I found a wire fragment inside one of the string holes of the Lamont harp, and it's actually a very sizable fragment. Simon, when he was looking at the CT scans with me, noticed a wire fragment on the CT scans of the Queen Mary harp, and we actually located that and extracted it and analyzed it. And that's this one. Here's the Queen Mary harp again. So when we opened it up, there was this wad of textile shoved into a crack and the wad has a little bit of wire wrapped around it to kind of hold it together. Now these little, what looks like little buttons, these are actually little wooden pegs that have been inserted into the string holes. I can tell you right now, those are modern, because the woods were examined, and they are tropical hardwoods of the sort that you would find in a musical instrument shop in the 19th century. They're the same sort of peg that would have been used on, say, a 19th century pedal harp to hold gut strings in. This harp was strung up at the beginning of the 19th century for an exhibition, and it was originally strung up with brass wire, and a Swiss harpist was brought over to play it, and who then decided, this isn't working, and he then took off the brass wire and put on gut strings and played with gut strings on it. And there's actually fragments of gut string left attached to these pegs, and he probably was the person, or whoever he was working with, who put these 19th century wooden pegs in here. So those aren't historical. So those are from the 19th century. But there was this wad of textile was wadded up with a wire wrapped around it. That's the wire that showed up on the CT scans, and it was just sort of shoved in this crack because this particular string hole it was sort of broken and it was too big, and I think the peg was probably not holding. I suspect this is modern, or 19th century, I should say. I have a couple of reasons to think that. One is there was a layer of varnish was put on the harp after these little wooden pegs were put in. They varnished the top of the harp at some point. You can see it was done with the pegs in there. And that has seeped down behind this. This was stuck to that. But at any rate, we took it out and we analyzed it. There it is, close up. This is what I mean. It was just shoved in to plug a hole, plug up a crack. That's the textile. It's linen, in case you're interested. We looked at it with the scanning electron microscope. We could tell that it was linen. There's the wire fragment. It's really cool looking. It's got these little bubbles of corrosion on it, and actually it was attacked by some bacteria. So it's actually some sort of quasi-bacterial corrosion thing going on there. That's what it looks like close up under scanning electron microscope. Okay, but what is this? What is this wire? We took a tiny sample off the end. It was hard to do because it was already a tiny little piece of wire. And what you have to do when you analyze wire, you have to polish the end. You take your sample, you embed it in resin, and then you polish the resin until you expose the very end of your sample so that you can hold it. Because this is what it looks like under the scanning electron microscope, and I'll show you a close-up. We took a small sample off the end of the analysis. You can see where the wire was twisted. See, there's little lines on the outside. You see where it was twisted around the toggle. So I can't say how all these wires were toggled, but I think we can say with pretty good certainty that that's how this one was toggled. They took the pin, they just went 1, 2, like that, and that's how it was done. And this is just showing, this image shows the surface structure, the surface diesel. This is corrosion. We can do two kinds, and this one shows the materials. Anything that's more dense shows up brighter. So here's corrosion on the outside, and this is some almost bare metal showing through. And here's where we took a sample off the end. Okay, so what is it? How big is it? And again, you can see this wire was not long for this world. It's got a big defect in it. See, there's like a big channel in here. It was a defective piece of wire, so I don't think it was going to last. You can see that it was drawn. So any little inclusions or little bits inside, when you draw a wire, those get lengthened, those get stretched out, and that's what you're seeing here. So it's a piece of drawn wire. Here's the end. Again, it was embedded in resin, and when the resin was polished off, there's a little bubble of air that got left here, unfortunately. So, but the rest of it got exposed. Here's this defect in the wire. There's a big, like, crack running on the inside of it that's filled with different material. So this wire was defective, it had a fault in it, so it was bound to break, I think, that's probably what caused this wire to break. Okay, diameter, 0.69 millimeters. So this is string hole 14, 0.69 millimeters is the gauge. And there wasn't a lot of corrosion on the outside. So we haven't lost a lot of the diameter. It might have been, you know, just very, very slightly bigger, maybe 0.7 or something. But this is pretty close probably to the original diameter. Okay, what's it made of? Okay, it's 74.3% copper. I took several measurements, and again, the measurements were taken. We sampled several different spots away from the edge, so that we're sure we're not getting corrosion, and away from this defect. 23% zinc, 2.1% lead, 0.3% nickel, and 0.18% iron. Everything else was in insignificant amounts that were below the error, the uncertainty in the measurement. Everything I'm showing you here is a significant amount above, significantly above our uncertainty in the measurement. So this is real. This isn't just noise, all this little stuff here. This is really interesting. There is data on historical brass, both from the 16th century and 17th century. There's very good data. And this composition with this amount of copper and zinc, and also with this amount of lead and the trace amounts of nickel and iron, is a very, very good match to brass from the second half of the 17th century. Okay, very, very close match. Okay, I would say that with very high likelihood that this wire fragment is from the second half of the 17th century. I can't say that somebody later on came and did something that's exactly the same, or possibly earlier, but 16th century brass is different in general, based on brass that's been studied, and quite a bit of it has that survives, and quite a bit of 17th century brass, particularly from harpsichord makers, and there was a big cache of brass from a maker that it's of known date, so it's not, gee, I wonder how old these strings are. It was a cache of unused strings of known date from the late 17th century, so we know the date of those, and this fits right in with those, and particularly in terms of the trace elements and the copper and zinc. So I think late 17th century, probably the third quarter, if not the whole second half. So this is, in that respect, almost certainly a piece of historical wire, and that's its makeup. The brass that's on your harps, those of you who have brass strings on your harps, if you get it, say, I know a lot of people get strings from Malcolm Rose, is not this, okay? It's a 30% zinc, 70% copper. It's a higher zinc, and it doesn't have these trace elements. This is really a significant amount of that. And I've been reading up on this, and it does make a difference in the ductability, the springiness, the softness of the string. So this makes a difference, I think, in the acoustics. Interestingly, the density of your Malcolm Rose brass, yellow brass wire, it works out, even though it's a different proportion, it's got different proportions and it doesn't have these, it works out to be almost exactly the same density. Because he's got more zinc, it makes up for not having the other stuff. It evens out.
What about the strength? What about the strength of the wire? Would this be weaker?
I don't know, I have to find out. I'll see if I
Even
can
with the
find out.
lead?
Yeah, I don't know. I'll find out.
I would suggest sending it on to Daniel Toth.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, and also Justine Bailey is another person, she's an historical metallurgist.
Yeah.
And, but yeah, so anyway, there's a lot, that's a good question, what, the brittleness, the Young's modulus, the strength, but now that we have this, exactly, let's go see what this does, and it would be really wonderful to have strings with this composition and to try them out, because it is different from what we're using right now. And so, okay, this is the,
Karen,
yes, go for it.
we've been going for quite a while. I don't want to stop you, but I'm just wondering if anybody wants a little 5-minute break.
Oh, yes,
Well, we continue
yeah,
with the
so
next
sorry
one.
to go on. And if anybody wants to leave or has to leave or is bored, give me the hook, or do people want a break?
Yes.
Yes,
Oh.
take a break. Take a break, yes.
5 minutes.
It's a dumb I'm talking predating.
That's what I was thinking, must be.
I'll do it next year, Paul, you know.
Sometime tomorrow.
Okay.
Thank you so much for your patience. As I was telling people during the break, I apologize that the talk is a little bit disjointed. I was trying to be careful and not go back over a lot of the stuff that I had talked about previously with the CT scans and with talking about the joinery and the hidden damage and repair work and what that tells us about what these instruments have gone through. I very much appreciate the input that people have been giving me here today. It was really fantastic. There's nothing like listening to people who actually work with the wood and try to build instruments like these harps. I've just got the meat course. This is the meat course, and then there's a little delicious dessert for you at the end. So if you get to the end, there's a delectable, lovely little thing for you. Okay, the thing about these harps, these two harps in particular, is what kind of wood are they made of? Now, we know from historical information that willow is a wood that is mentioned that was traditionally used for these harps, for early Irish harps. At least that's what the historical information tells us. Back in 1969, the wood was sampled in all parts of the frame of both of these harps. And I'll read this out to you. After a considerable amount of difficulty, I have now succeeded in identifying the wood from which both the Lamont and Queen Mary harps were constructed. I think that I mentioned to you that my first impression was a rosaceous timber, possibly hawthorn apple, but microscopic examination shows this not to be the case. I am now 99% certain, 99, not 100, 99% certain that the timber used was hornbeam. It's Carpinus betulus, so it's used from hornbeam. And he goes on to say, this wood was used for all parts of both harps. Now, this has proven, this was in 1969. A.J. Hayes was a professor of forestry at the University of Edinburgh. So the harps were sampled, and the samples were sent to the University of Edinburgh, and they had a woods expert do microscopic examination. I've seen his report, and you can tell he did a microscopic examination. He didn't just look at it and say, oh, I think it's hornbeam. Since then, this has been very controversial. Hornbeam, Carpinus betulus, is a very dense, incredibly hard wood. Is there anybody in this room, I know some woodworkers in here, who has had to work with hornbeam? They're all saying, no way!
What is it in German?
I can only say Carpinus betulus. Oh, I do, we'll know in a minute. I can't remember. I have it, but I'll tell you in a minute. You'll know in a minute. It's a very hard wood. It dulls tools almost instantly. You work it for a little bit, you have to go back and resharpen your tools. Can you imagine carving out a hornbeam sound box? It's like iron wood. But then again, this guy, he's a woods expert. He did a proper microscopic examination. He says it's hornbeam. But since then, people said there's no way. How could it? And also, all three frame members of both of these very different harps that look like they were made by different people at different times they're all hornbeam, really? Really? So Peacock said, no way. But then, this is, he did an examination and that's what he came up with, so what's up with that? When we CT scanned the harps, one of the things that a CT scan shows you, and these are images from the CT scans. The top one is the Lama harp, the bottom one is the Queen Mary. One of the things that you see is the density of the material. The CT scan is essentially a three-dimensional X-ray of whatever you're scanning. And material that is more dense in this picture shows up darker. So here are the metal cheek bands. The metal's very dense and they show up like black on these images. All the metal parts show up as black, straps and string shoes and nails and stuff like that. The little dots are putty, the dense putty that's been used to fill holes and stuff. But the other thing you notice is here's the wood, light gray soundbox woods. The wood's a lot less dense than the metal part, so it looks just sort of light gray. Here's the wood of the neck of the Queen Mary. This piece of wood is not the same density as this piece of wood. This piece of wood, here's the four pillar of the Lama harp. This piece of wood is not the same density as this piece of wood. Are you telling me they're from the same tree? It could happen, you could be from different parts of the tree, maybe different hornbeam trees. I went and measured the densities, and you can actually get physical measurements of the densities that you can compare to wood species. Here's the density range for hornbeam that's been air dried, okay, not kiln dried. And it's right in here. And here are the density, this is the sound boxes of both harps are down around in between 0.5 and 0.6. So it's like 0.56 or something. Here are the four pillar, the Lama harp four pillars in two pieces. One of them, okay, could be. The others, maybe not. The lines represent my uncertainty in my measurements, okay? So they could be anywhere within this line. Here's the neck. Okay, Queen Mary maybe. No way. The back covers, no. But the sound box, there's no way this is hornbeam. Unless, okay, well, what if the wood was treated in some way, like ponding or who knows what, that caused the density to change? Maybe it is hornbeam, but something was done to the wood. That's a very good question. That's something to think about. Maybe there's something wrong with my measurements.
Can I ask,
Yeah.
have you already factored in the changes in density over all the hundreds of years?
Yes. And then what happens is the density, there's a big change in density very early on, and then it just levels off, and it stays fairly constant until you get to the point where the wood disintegrates and there's nothing left. So, yes. But that's a good point. Maybe, could it be that the sound box is older? But no, even the age, let's say the sound box was much older than the rest of the harp, and it's just, the density has changed over time. You would only get a change in density at the beginning, and then it would level off, and you wouldn't see an additional change in density as it gets older. So it's not enough. Age would not account for this. And even, it's hard to come up with ways to think, that's a good one. Gee, how could this be? So I don't know. It's, this is a question. When I showed that graph to the museum and the scans, they agreed that it was worthwhile resampling the wood and checking this. So when we had the harps out in December, we took samples, actually the conservators took samples from the wood. I'm showing you this because, just so that you understand, because I'm going to step you through this. We're going to do one, identification. We're going to identify the wood for the sound box of the Queen Mary harp. We'll do it here today. And I'll step you through it. Tika Ogilvie, the head of conservation, as I mentioned, is a woods expert. Her area of expertise is archaeological wood. She did the identifications. They are still in process. We have not finished. We've done the sound boxes of both harps, and we're in the process of doing the four pillar and neck of the Queen Mary harp. okay? It's a very long process to get it right. We want to get it right. Part of the reason it's a long process is the wood is old and it's deteriorated. And you can't just say, gee, I think, because we don't want to make a mistake. The way we sampled the wood, Ticket had to think, no pun intended, outside the box. Sorry. Normally, the standard way to do this is to take a very sharp razor blade and take a thin shaving off at the appropriate angle to the plane of the wood. And ideally, you need 3 samples to identify your wood. You need one. Here's a picture of a stump that I drew. I'm very proud of my drawing. You need to take a shaving off. You need to look at this face of the wood. That's across the stump. That's the transverse. So across the stump, you need to look at this face of the wood, the tangential. That's tangential to the side of the stump. And you need to look at this face. That's the radial plane. That's going from the center to the outside edge. You need to look at all 3 because wood is a 3-dimensionally structured material. And the way wood is structured, the best way I can explain it is, imagine a bunch of drinking straws. Okay, imagine your drinking straws going up and down the tree. And also imagine in between the drinking straws, there are a lot of little coffee stirrers. You know the little coffee stirrers that are like little tiny straws that you can sip? I love those. The little plastic ones. Not the wooden ones that they have at Starbucks, the other kind of plastic ones. Okay, so you've got big drinking straws and little teeny tiny straws packed together. And in between those, you've got what look like sort of brick walls. And those are the rays, and they run this way. Okay, and we'll see those in a minute. Now, what Ticket did, instead of doing these shavings, because there's no place on either of these harps that you can do that without marring the surface of the instrument. And we saw where the samples were taken previously, at least some of the places. And Hayes, the guy who took the samples, he was very limited. He was only able to get this one. He didn't get this or this as far as we can tell. I suspect what happened was the museum said to him, look, you can take a sample here. You can't take a sample here. You can't take a sample here. I think he was very, very limited in where he could take his samples because you have to find a place that's not going to show. I don't think he had access to the inside of the sound box because there's no evidence that any samples were taken from the inside because that would be the obvious place to take a sample is from the inside, especially since you can also get the neck because you can get the neck tank. What Ticket did is she didn't do the big shavings because that's kind of destructive. And that lab, their mantra is non-invasive analysis or minimally invasive. So what she did was she said, look, we have a scanning electron microscope upstairs. What we will do is I will take a microscalpel and I will take micro samples, little blocks about the size of a large breadcrumb. Okay, so about 2 millimeters on the side. And then what she did, under a lab microscope with her microscalpel, is she cut those blocks so that the sides were exactly aligned with these planes. That's why it took her so long to, that's why the harps were sitting. You know, she had to very carefully take these samples and she said, you have one chance. You cannot go like that. You have to get it in one thing. And it was like neurosurgery. It was amazing watching her. Absolutely amazing. Okay. This is one of them. This is from the sound box of the Lamont harp. And that's actually, she would probably be embarrassed if I showed you this because she thinks this is not that great. But I just wanted to show you what it looks like. So this is a scanning electron microscope image. Just to let you know, 500 microns is a ½ millimeter for people who are not used to microns. So 1,000 microns is a millimeter. Okay. The Queen Mary harp. Remember the drinking straws? Those are called, these are the ends of the drinking straws here. Okay, these are the coffee stirrers, okay? These are the ends of the drinking straws. Okay, sometimes you have two drinking straws that are bunched together, and they're all, put it this way, the rays are, we're looking at the ends of the brick wall, that's the top of a brick wall. So we're looking at across the stump, this is across the stump, okay? The drinking straws are called vessels, and the ends are called pores. They're like the pores in your skin, think of it that way. Now, this tells us right away that this is a hardwood. Only hardwoods have vessels, okay? Softwoods don't. So by hardwood I mean things like maple, whether it's some oak, maple. Softwoods are conifers, okay? It doesn't mean a wood that's harder than, some hardwoods are softer than some softwoods, okay? The names are confusing, but coniferous versus non-coniferous. So by softwood we mean pine, spruce, fir, that kind of thing. Hardwood we mean maple, oak, beech, all the other guys, the broadleaf trees. This is a hardwood. It's absolutely definite. Only hardwoods have vessels. Okay, so we've already eliminated all the softwoods. It is not a softwood. But, okay, these are the remaining, these are the hardwoods. And, okay, there's, by taxa, that doesn't just mean species, that means genus as well. So there's actually probably, if you broke it down into individual species, there's probably thousands, okay? But I thought, well, we can do it. You're all looking at the clock going, holy, you know, how late is she gonna, don't worry. We can do it, you'll see. Okay, so that's vessels, okay. Also, the arrangement of the vessels. There's three ways they can be arranged. The drinking straws can be arranged. Either they're all bunched together in a band, in bands, and that's called ring pores. Or they're sort of semi-bunched together in bands, or they're just scattered about. These are just scattered about evenly. That means it's diffuse porous. That automatically eliminates a bunch of species of trees like walnut, for example, semi-porous. Also, some of them come in pairs, and they come in pairs. That also eliminates them. All right, so we've eliminated some. We're still,
But this is your international. I see the neem tree and.
Yeah, so there's,
Kukuruz,
yeah.
that's-
Yeah, so they're, I think they're in German as well. Yeah. So,
Yeah,
okay.
it's worldwide.
Yeah, so this is worldwide. Even, I mean, we're making it hard for ourselves. I'm not even just limiting this to European species. This is everything, okay? Or most everything. I mean, the list isn't entirely complete, but it's most everything. Okay. Also, the bunches, when the straws are bunched together, they're just in short, like two. Not like big, long chains, okay? They're just in little short chains. The ones that are bunched together in short chains aligned with the rays. That eliminates one, but we're still, oh my gosh, you're thinking, Jesus, Karen, why are you doing this? It's about to get interesting. We gotta look at another plane. This is the one this is the radial plane. This is going from the center of the stump out to the outer surface, okay? And this is where we see the brick walls. Here's our brick wall. There's a brick wall, that's a ray. There's another brick wall, okay? It really does look like a brick wall. Now, some brick walls, in some tree species, all the bricks are lying down horizontally, all the courses of bricks, but in some other tree species, the top course of bricks, or the bottom course of bricks, the bricks are standing up on end, okay? This tree species, the bricks are standing up on end, on the top and bottom courses. That's what the letter A is pointing to. That's important, that helps us. Also, there's this other little thing, see these little holes here? These are a way that the rays can communicate fluid and nutrients with the vessels, and we're only seeing them on the ends, not in the middle, and that's also important. We'll get to that in a minute. Okay, so what do we got here? Okay, it's got rays, and the rays have 2 or more cell types. That means it's got bricks in the top course of bricks. The bricks are standing on end. Okay, so that helps us a lot. It's still looking bad though, Cameron. Oh my gosh. All right. It's about to get interesting. Again, here's that same picture again. This is important actually. It looks like a really detailed. This is important because There aren't very many trees that do that. We're down to 8 taxa. There are very few tree species that have this, and this one is one of them. Well, okay, so let's see what we got. Okay, yeah, so,
Handbook. Okay.
Hindbook,
It's a
okay,
very hard
thank you.
wood, yeah.
I knew it was in there somewhere. Okay, so we've got 8 taxa. By taxa I mean either genus or species. So but here's our Carpinus up here, and I don't know if you guys in the back can read all those. Don't worry if you can't. But there's some exotic ones in there, some familiar ones in there. Okay, let's see. Okay. Let's see where this takes us. Okay, so we're already most of the way there. But we gotta narrow it down, right? We're gonna, by the time we get here, we'll be down to 1. That's what we want, right? We want 1.
We have 3 left now.
And we want to be, it can't be anything else. This is done by process of elimination. I'm doing this with you because I think it is so important for you to know where your information comes from. This was the problem with the hornbeam ID. This guy said it was hornbeam. Well, okay, why does he think it's hornbeam? We don't know, because he says so, right? The information shouldn't be a black box. We should understand what's going on. Okay, so here's what's left. I just blew it up so you can see it. So we've got our hornbeam is there, so it could be hornbeam, but there's some exotic stuff to below and some less exotic stuff. So let's see what happens. Okay, here's another important thing. It looks like a tiny little thing. I had to blow this up. These are, when you've got 2 drinking straws that are next to each other, they want to talk to each other. They have little windows where you can wave. No, literally. So think of these as windows where the straws wave to each other. And so those little circles are the windows. And that's actually where fluid can flow back and forth between the vessels, the windows. And the way they're arranged varies depending upon the species of tree. And in this species of tree, they can either be arranged lined up in rows and columns, like on a grid, or they can be arranged alternately, like checkerboard, and these are arranged alternately.
Karen, what plane is this?
What's that?
What plane is this?
Oh, thank you. This is still the radial plane. Still the radial plane. In fact, there's the edge of a brick wall right there. We just zoomed in close up. So, and in fact, here's 1/10 of a millimeter is this thing. So we're looking, yeah. It's really great having a scanning mechanism. Okay, that eliminates some species. So we're down to 4 taxa.
4 contestants.
We got our last 4 contestants. Hornbeam's still there. Okay,
Oops.
still there. It could be hornbeam. Okay, it really could be hornbeam. But we need to be sure, and it's worth, even if it comes out to be hornbeam, it really is worth verifying that. So here they are. And so we've got these 2 European guys, and these are exotics. These are from Southeast Asia, but I'm going to leave them in there. We will see if they will properly eliminate them. If we're going to eliminate them, we'll do it properly. We're not going to assume anything. No assumptions. See what happens. Okay. This is not a picture of the Queen Mary hardwood. This is a picture of hornbeam. We went out, we got a piece of hornbeam, and we took a cut it using exactly the same tools, exactly the same method. We put it in the scanning electron microscope, and just as a comparison. And so this is what hornbeam looks like. Hornbeam has really, really tall brick walls. It's got tall brick walls. It's got a bunch of other features too. But again, it's got, like our sample, the top course is upright bricks, and the intervessel pits, the vessel ray pits, sorry, are only at the top and bottom of the brick wall. So far, this particular sample has a taller brick wall, but that's not necessarily distinguishing. It is in the long run, but our sample could have been, maybe we missed a big. Maybe our sample just happened to only have short brick walls, and we could have missed one. But hornbeam has this. Inside the drinking straws, imagine if somebody took a tube of cake decorator. You know the cake decorator where you can draw happy birthday, or real birthday? Okay, so imagine if somebody took the world's tiniest tube of cake decorator, the micro tube, and they went inside the drinking straw. this is what they're called helical thickenings, but what it looks like is somebody took and did inside the drinking straw, and you get these little stripes inside. Okay, hornbeam does that. Here it is close up, you can see it better here. See that? Sorry, I don't have a scale. Oh, I don't have a scale on this one. Sorry about that. I try to keep the scale, but super close up. Okay. This is the Queen Mary harp. Doesn't have those. They're completely absent. And this is a fresh surface, and this feature is in the lignin. It's not a part of the wood that deteriorates easily. So we would expect to, even if the wood is old, we would expect to still see it there, and it's not anywhere. Ooh, everybody go, ooh, yeah. And again, here's another, I went and checked, this is the tangential plane, and I'll talk about that in a bit, but I just wanted to show you it's not anywhere. These are this is as if you took a drinking straw and you sliced it lengthwise, and you were looking at the inside of the drinking straw, and it's clean as a whistle. No cake decorating. Okay. No helical thickness. That's the cake decorating stuff. It's gone. It's not there. It can't be hornbeam. Okay? The sound box, this is really, really important. This is something, that's why the subtitle of my talk. That's why I had that subtitle. This is something that's been hanging over us for over 40 years. Oh, the Queen Mary harp is made out of hornbeam. It is not made out of hornbeam. Okay, at least the sound box is. It is not hornbeam. That's definite. It is not hornbeam. That's a really important result.
Oh, that deserves a round of applause.
We still have more than one thing here.
No.
We're almost at Oh no, it could be one of these.
Walking to the pub.
Yeah, it could be one of these examples.
So you just went and pick up this money, gotta go.
You never know, right? Well, let's see. Okay, let's finish this up. Okay. Also, here's another picture. This is the tangential plane of a piece of hornbeam that we know is hornbeam. This is our hornbeam sample. Here's the helical thickenings. Also, this is what, imagine you've got your brick wall, it's running along your property line, and you get to the end of the brick wall. This is the end of the brick wall, okay? And these are little holes are the bricks. And in hornbeam, in some species you have brick wall, brick wall, brick wall, brick wall. And hornbeam, you have brick wall, brick wall, brick wall, up right against each other, packed together. You get some that are by themselves, but sometimes you get them brick wall, brick wall, brick wall, brick wall. And hornbeam does that. Other species do that too. And so you get these brick walls bunched, just packed together. And that's something that hornbeam does. Another thing that hornbeam does is the brick walls aren't just one course of brick thick, they're like two courses. Some of them are two courses of brick thick. So like this one doesn't just have one stack of bricks, but in places there's two. Here's one. It's not just one brick thick, the wall. This is a wall that's one brick thick. This one's two brick thick. Brick. I can't say bricks thick. It's too thick. It's too brick thick. Okay. That's what hornbeam does. This is the Queen Mary harp sound box. This is the tangential plane. So this is tangential to the edge of the trunk. There are no bunched together brick walls, not in the sample. And this is actually only a section of the sample. This isn't the whole sample. But we saw none. And we did not see any brick walls that are too thick. Okay. You get the occasional that has a split one, but that's not the same thing.
They're also much shorter.
Yeah, they're also much shorter. Yeah.
Do
I
the
didn't
walls,
see any that were more than, I think, 12 tall, 12 bricks tall.
Karen, do the walls go vertical in the other type of wood?
Yes, yeah, sorry,
Versus
this
diagonal.
picture's, sorry, that's a good question. This picture's rotated. So the tree if you were to go up and down the trees this way, okay? So thank you for pointing that out. I apologize for showing you a rotated image. So the brick walls are always perpendicular, always upright in the tree, okay? This piece of wood is just rotated, okay? That's important. And also, okay, so aggregate rays, so that means there's no rays bunched together. Also, and the rays are only 1 brick thick, and those 2 exotic woods, that eliminated them. Okay, so what are we left with?
Yay!
It's willow. That's definite. That's absolutely definite. He was 99% certain this is 100%. I guess, well, I don't want to say 100, because nothing's 100% certain in this life.
99.9.
99.999. It's willow.
From which
Okay.
part was this sample taken now? From the sandbox? Or?
Ask me later. I'll have to dig out the
The sandbox.
But it's from the
I'll have to
sandbox.
dig out the diagram. We took, just inside the sound box, just below the rabbited edge. And I think she took samples for the Queen Mary, she actually took 3 samples from different places, because what she did was, she then, she took 1 or 2 small samples using the traditional method to compare. And she examined them just using the traditional method as a comparison, as a control. And this is actually a clue to what happened with the previous identification. Why did he get it wrong? He was an expert. What happened? Why did he come up with hornbeam? Yeah, go ahead.
Just because he said he was an expert, I'm sure everybody in this room, if I give him a hornbeam made harp and a willow harp, and I tell to you that the hornbeam first is heavier, everybody will be able to discriminate first. And what I try to do is to be careful with your harps. We have fingernails. So with the wood you can find out a lot with your fingernails. Like a lime tree you can carve with your fingernails. A hornbeam,
Yeah,
no way.
yeah. He wasn't thinking about the macroscopic properties of the wood. He wasn't thinking, I think what he was doing was he's saying, look, I'm not going to make any assumptions. Remember, he even said in his letter, I thought it was rosaceous or,
Okay.
but then when he looked at it under the microscope, he said, well, I'm just going to go by what I see under the microscope. And he came up with that. Well, I think what happened was when the samples were taken, took a notice, she took a very small sample from the inside of the sound box of the Queen Mary, and she tried prepping it the normal way, and she said the wood doesn't have enough integrity. It started to disintegrate before her eyes, even though she was being incredibly careful, and she's done this thousands of times with other woods. And also, as I said before, we're pretty sure he was only able to get that first plane that we looked at when we were looking at the ends of the drinking straws. We're pretty sure that was all he had to go by. And that's not enough. You saw, it's not enough. And if he had a sample that was compromised, that was starting to fall apart, and he's only seeing one plane, and the museum is saying, well, you can't have any more samples. If I was him, I would have said, well, I'm sorry, then you're not getting a wood ID out of me. But who knows what, it'd be nice to be a fly on the wall. Maybe he thought, well, I'll just tell them what I think it is, and he had no idea what the implications were going to be of what he said.
Very heavy heart.
So, yeah, very heavy harps. So I would say there's no reason to make a sound box out of hornbeam. I will also say we did the Lamont, and the Lamont harp sound box is also willow. It's a different willow. I'm not able to distinguish species. Willow trees, are the genus willow. There are a lot of different species, and it's hard to distinguish them. I'm hoping that we might be able to get in contact with somebody, say for example at Kew Gardens, who might be able to tell us a little bit more about which species of willow, if we can. But they're from different trees. They're definitely different. As I said, we're in the process of doing the neck and the 4-pillar of the Queen Mary. It's been very difficult. The 4-pillar wood is weird because it's a branch, it's a piece of roundwood, and it's very young wood, and so the structure's a little bit odd. I'll say this much, I shouldn't say this because the ID's not complete, and Tika would probably say, no, don't say anything, but I'll tell you. We've narrowed it down, they're not willow. I'll tell you right now, the four pillar and the neck of the Queen Mary harp are not willow. Okay, they're different species. And it looks like the harp is made from 3 distinct species of wood. Okay. It's looking like it's hard to say. The one that comes up is pear wood for actually either the neck or the four pillar. I'm not sure, and so don't say that's definite. That's definitely not definite, okay? But that's a very strong possibility for either of those. I don't know.
Anything else going on?
Yeah, there's a wood called serviceberry, and I don't have the botanical name in my head right now, but it's also called checkerwood, and that's also a possibility. We thought box for a while for the neck, but it's looking like it's maybe not box, unless there's some structures that got destroyed in the wood that we're no longer seeing. So we'll have to get back to you on that. We may have to send off our images to an expert because the wood is just, it's deteriorated, and we don't want to guess. We don't want another hornbeam mistake. So we're actually not going to say, well, yeah, it's probably this, because it might turn out not to be that. We haven't imaged the neck and four pillar of the Lamont part yet. Tika just took a sample from the top half of the four pillar, so we don't have the bottom replacement part. We have samples, we have a sample from the back cover of the Queen Mary harp that we will also image. We haven't imaged that yet. It has to be correctly imaged. So I'll be able to tell you something about that. Yeah, it's probably not a bottomwood anyway, based on, as I mentioned earlier, based on looking at the inside, you can see there's some places where the wood is very low and it's not bottomwood. So anyway, oh yes, dessert. I almost forgot dessert. There is a dessert for you, and it's worth it. As exciting as this was, there's something else that's exciting. But this is pretty exciting. Okay. While I was photographing the inside of the Lamont harp, I wanted to get an image of some of the marks inside there. They're around the string holes. This is a close-up, and I apologize for not having a scale in this particular image. It was one I added this morning. This is the view of the string holes as seen from inside the harp. So if you had your head inside the sound box and you were looking through the string holes, that's what you would see. And around the string holes there are these indentations, and I think they're probably from tablas, string tablas. I wanted to photograph those so that I could count them, and I needed to set up the light. We had a bank of lab lights. The lights that we use in the lab, by the way, are conservation filtered lights. They do a lot of work with textiles and that sort of thing. So any of the lighting that I was using was, not the kind of light that harms the instruments. But anyway, I had a bank of lights, and I had to set them off to the side so that the light was coming in at a very raking angle so that I could see these very fine little indentations. And I set up the light, and I had the camera set up on its tripod, and I was getting ready to photograph. And I looked, and we'd had the sound box open before. We had the sound box of this harp open in 2010. And that's when we found this 17th century vellum document hidden inside, which is kind of fun and exciting, that I've talked about before with you guys, or some of you guys. But anyway, that we saw that, and, okay. But I saw something that we hadn't seen before, because it's something that you can only see when the light is at a very steep angle. And this is an old photograph from 2010, but the thing that I saw is right here inside this red box. It's not a red box. I did the red box on the picture. This is the vellum document here, by the way. glued on, it's glued over a crack in the side of the sound box, it's glued on with animal glue, and then there's these straps that have been recycled probably from a casket with a circle and dot design that possibly quite old. Anyway, there's something inscribed in the wood inside this box. Would you like to see it?
Nah.
No, it's too late. It's too late.
Finish the talk
No,
now.
it's too late, finished up
Yeah,
now, isn't it?
you're
Sorry.
gone too long.
Sorry.
Sorry,
No,
we just turn off the projector.
That's when the bulb should burn out. Now, there's a couple people in this room who've seen this, so you can act surprised. I'll tell you, it's a date.
Me?
Yeah, that's right. No, it's a date. Now, well, I'll just show it to you. And I can say, no, I'll just show it to you. What? It says AD 1451, and it's been chiseled into the wood. Now, okay, what we have to do though is we have to find out, well, is that date contemporary? I mean, was it done, was that chiseled in AD 1451, or was that somebody later messing about and putting in a date?
Was it you in 2010?
It wasn't.
At 10 to 3 in the afternoon.
I swear to God, no, the funny thing about this was, I had just finished having a discussion with conservation about carbon dating these harps, and they had just finished saying to me, no, you can't, because the sample size would be too big. And I was going, nah. And everybody broke for lunch, and I was in the lab by myself, with the camera and the harp open, and I saw this, and I went in to the head conservation, I said, there's a date. She said, did you put that in there? I swear it wasn't me, and you can actually see it if you go back to the 2010 photos. You can actually just kind of make it out in those old photos. Not particularly well.
Can you show the photo before, please?
What's that?
The one before.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
So here's
How
where.
old are these brackets? Or is this copper or what is it?
Oh yeah, those are. I don't know if they're copper or if they're. I mean, I don't know if they're bronze or brass. They're copper alloy. And that's really.
How old are they, or
Yeah.
anybody?
What's that?
What is the age of these ones?
Well, David Caldwell, who was the keeper at the time and who's an expert in West Highland art, he looked at. Unfortunately, I didn't bring photographs of close-ups of these. They're decorated, okay, with a dot and circle design. And he looked at them when we opened up the sound box. He looked at them. Actually, we opened up the sound box, and I said, "There's writing on that," because there's writing on this, which is really cool. And somebody went and got David Caldwell, and he looked at this and he said, "Those look like they're 15th century." And I kind of went, "I don't
You know
know."
why I'm asking? Because from the sign of a builder, now we do this on the doors inside in Austria everywhere. If I repair a harp, I put in this piece, and on top I would put the date of doing it. Rather, when you build the harp itself, you would never put the thing generally
Yeah, it's a
somewhere in
weird
the
place to
middle.
put a date.
You would.
It is.
You would though, you signed that. You
Just
signed it.
somewhere in
You
the
booked
middle?
a ticket, yeah.
Yeah.
Put a sound box
Well,
on the
yeah, okay, so here's, well, I'm ending you with a mystery. There's a mystery here. I mean, how did this get here? What's this about? Yeah, so the repair, this piece of vellum has early 17th century handwriting on it. And it has some names and a partial, no, it doesn't have partial, but it's got names and places on it. And Keith Sanger has pinned it down to being, it's the outside of a charter, which is sort of like, it's like a mortgage kind of, it's like a mortgage document. It's supposed to describe it to.
Just
And,
tried to get rid of it.
and hide it in the heart. There you go. No, actually, it's actually what probably happened, and he's narrowed down. He's really good at looking in archives, and he's narrowed it down to like I think between that document dates somewhere between 1615 and 1620, most likely. And so the repair would have had to happen after that, and he says probably not too terribly long after that document was, you know, the mortgage gets repaid and it's just sitting in your desk with the other vellum. Vellum, these documents, normally these charters are kept tri-folded, and vellum gets hard after a while. It gets very stiff, and so he's thinking, well, maybe, you know, by 1650 or somewhere around that, somewhere before then, that this was, you know, was handy. We could slap it on there. There's a crack in the side here, and it's great for repairing that crack. However, and that crack, and I talked about this in another talk, that crack, it looks like from the way the sides have sucked in. The side is sucked in on this side, but on this side. And that's what happens when you put the sound box under the tension of the strings. The front of the soundboard pulls up, and the sides suck in as you pull up. Like if you took a cardboard box and you attached a string to the box, top of the box, there's a floppy box, and you pulled on the string, the sides would suck in. But this side's not sucked in because it had that crack acting as a hinge. Which made me think that was crack happened early on in the life of this harp. But it's got these straps on it. It's possible that this repair is not the first time that crack's been repaired. That might be a second repair. Maybe the straps were in there before and there was something else. I don't know. So it's weird because that vellum was put on there probably in the first half of the 17th century. But these straps, they recall both things to the 15th century, and then it says AD 1451. Now, AD 1451 is interesting because according to the family history that goes with this harp, the reason it's called the Lamont harp is because it was part of the belongings of Lilias Lamont when she married into the Tarleton, later Robertson family, in 1460 or 1464. So the family had always maintained that the harp was from the 15th century because she had this harp, according to their family history, she had this harp when she got married in the 1460s. But we had nothing to corroborate that. And then I saw this repair that looked like it was from the early 17th century. I thought, well, maybe the family history is a little bit exaggerated, and no. But then there's this date that says 1451, which agrees with the family history, but then did somebody just stick that in? I know that date was there before this vellum was glued on, because if you look at close-up photographs of, well, unfortunately I don't have one here, but on the old photographs from 2010, you can actually see where the glue, there's actually extra glue that kind of goes out from behind the vellum. You know, they took the glue and they smeared it on and they slapped that vellum on. And some of the glue has pooled into the chisel marks of the date. So the chisel marks were there, and then the glue was put on and it kind of pooled into part of it. So they were there when that vellum was put on. So if the vellum was put on in the 17th century, this can't have been put on in the 19th century. Okay? So this was not somebody in the 19th century messing about.
What's the picture again at the
Yeah.
at the date?
Yeah, and I got another one. Also, you can see the A a little bit better in this one. You can see it has a cross piece here. It was very hard to photograph this. I would love to have better photographs. It was really super hard to photograph this. They took the trouble of making this stuff wide. Keith Sanger took these photographs to the National Archives in Scotland. One of the questions is, well, are these numerals, and these two letters, are they consistent with the 15th century? Because if they're not, then game over. So he took it to the National Archives in Edinburgh, and it went up the chain to like the top. They were like really interested in this, and it is consistent. Those numerals are, in fact, they've got two documents. Keith's got two. He was able to find two documents. One from AD 1450, I think, or 1448, and from AD 1453, Scottish documents, and the form of the numbers is consistent with these.
And
Okay.
then sorry,
Go ahead.
can you say what two exactly was it?
At the end of the chisel. So imagine if you took a chisel and took the flat end, actually, if you took the flat end of a chisel and you just very, very lightly tapped it, just the flat end, can you see how the A was done? See, there's a chisel mark
Yeah,
there.
it's not caught, you can see it's not caught.
Yeah,
It's
it's, somebody took a
twisted.
chisel, yeah, so it wasn't somebody doing this.
Yeah, it's
If somebody took a chisel and tap, 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 if you, in fact, if you look at this,
Yeah, yeah.
there's a chisel, there's a chisel, there's a chisel there. The D is a little bit different because they had to do the round part, I'm not sure I did, but yeah, so then they took a chisel and just lightly tapped with the flat end of the chisel. Now, having said that about the form of the letters and numbers, there's not much to go by here, okay? And actually, you know, yeah, that's consistent with the middle of the 15th century in Scotland, but it's also consistent with other time periods as well. So it doesn't rule out other time periods. All we can say is, yes, it could be from the 15th century. You can't rule that out. But again, it could be from other time periods as well. However, I can say this much. If that vellum document was put in there in the first half of the 17th century, that inscription was done before that was put in. Okay? So it's no more recent than the first half of the 17th century. Okay? I can say that I'm pretty certain of that. So it wasn't somebody in the 19th century. It wasn't the person who bought the harp at the auction. It wasn't anybody in the museum. It wasn't Gunn who had the harp examined for the Society of Antiquaries in the early 19th century. That was there already. Okay? So that tells us something. That eliminates a lot of naughtiness. So we're down to the person who did this repair, and if that repair was done in the 17th century, I don't know. I honestly don't know. I can't answer this. So it's a bit of a mystery. It's a very tantalizing mystery. If this turns out to be genuinely contemporary, this is the oldest inscribed dated harp. I think. I don't know, Andrew. Are there older harps in Europe that we know the date of?
Not for sure.
I can't
Okay.
think of any.
The
She's not
actual
sure.
surviving instruments, the Eisenach is the oldest. I'm not sure. It hasn't been properly dated.
It doesn't have
That's-
a described date.
That's,
It
yeah,
doesn't
certainly
have
not with an actual date, and the dates are the ones where they're trying to assign dates, then it's very contested. And anyway, yeah. So the short answer is no.
Okay, and if this is actually the date of that sound box, then that acts as a very important signpost for us for the other early harps, because this sound box is really quite different from the Queen Mary and the Trinity. Not to say that they're from different days. You can have different things. You can have different designs of a sound box from the same date, but it's something to think about. You know, if this is a 15th century harp, then are the Trinity harp and the Queen Mary harp, are they 15th century or not? Are they earlier? So anyway, yeah, okay. So lots to think about. Thank you. Questions? Again, apologies if it was a little bit disjointed. I kind of wanted to give you a taster of different things, and it was really difficult putting this talk together because there's a huge, huge mass of data, and it's very much a work in progress, and we're still sifting through it. And I love all of your input, everything that you have to say. It goes in here, and I think about it, and I go home and I think about what you have to say, and it's all valuable. And if there's something I didn't, I left a lot out. So if it looked like I was kind of glossing over things, there's more stuff sort of behind that. But if anybody has some questions.
I have a question. What's the situation with radiocarbon dates on any or all of the harps?
I think it's time to go back to the museum and kind of push for that, particularly in light of this
Because
inscription.
they've refused up till now.
Yeah, the issue is, and actually I agree with the conservation people, because it turns out in order to get a radiocarbon date on wood, even with the modern methods which uses counting of individual carbon-14 atoms, which is really very, very sensitive and uses smaller samples than previously. It's done by weight, not by volume. And this wood is very, very light. And the way you get your sample, you can't have contamination from the surface of the wood. So what you have to do is you have to take a clean drill bit, and in a clean room, and the drill bit has to be about like 4 millimeters, okay, a quarter inch, yeah. 4 millimeter drill bit. Drill about 4 millimeters into the wood. Throw that material out. You can't use it. It's contaminated with by the surface. Then drill an additional 4 millimeters into the wood. Carefully, after cleaning your drill, carefully take that sample out, and that's what gets used for the carbon dating. So you have to put a fairly sizable hole into that instrument to get your material for carbon dating. And so you're talking about, that much out of the instrument. And do you want to do that in the sound box, the 4-pillar limit? And that's what made the conservation department say, I don't think so. We looked at the possibility of doing dendrochronology, especially now that we know the species of the sound boxes, because in the CAT scans you can see the growth rings, but the CAT scans don't have enough resolution to do proper dendrochronology. However, one possibility is people can do X-ray dendrochronology with just standard X-ray film. X-ray film has higher resolution than the CAT scan. It's just not three-dimensional, and you can't take measurements. So one possibility would be if you could put an X-ray film inside the sound box and take an X-ray of those growth rings, you might be able to do dendrochronology. That's something I want to talk to the museum about. But the previous keeper and actually the previous head of conservation both said, yeah, you should really carbon date this, really, because they're retired now, so it's not their responsibility. The current person's like, and I can totally understand. I mean, you're talking about a plug of wood that big, and that's a lot. But we're going to revisit this because I think it's really important, especially I can't think of any other way of verifying that inscribed date without doing some independent dating. Otherwise, it's just like, well, there's a date inside there, but we don't know. Except that I would say that it's certainly it predates that vellum repair, and if that vellum repair is first half of the 17th century, then it's not from more recent.
Yeah, just the first question is, are you going to publish all that data from the British Museum in your work? Are you going to have text or an appendix or something?
That's technically not part of my dissertation work,
Right.
but I think that the Historical Art Society of Ireland should really have a copy of this.
Yeah.
And it's very easy to get a copy, and I would give, in fact, the person to contact is on here somewhere. Let me know, and I will email you, where is she? There we go. Janet Ambrose from the British Museum Department of Conservation. I will email you her details. I think you should have that in your library. And you can get a copy. It just involves, she was incredibly nice to work with, and it just involved, I had to get Trinity College's permission. I had to contact Bernie Meehan because it's their artifact. But he was fine with it. It was just a matter of sending an email, and he was like, yeah, no problem. I can't publish that stuff. I can't publish material from, I probably quote from it, but I can't publish photographs or anything like that without the permission of Trinity College.
So if, for example, if we want to have access to the information, so we just have to contact Trinity and that.
Yeah, and I'll give you the contact with him, because I think you should have a copy of it, and it's just a PDF.
It's absolutely right.
Yeah, and I was just giving you little snippets out of it. It's really, yeah, I wish there was more, but it's got little nuggets in there that are like, wow, this is really interesting. So, yeah, I'll give you that.
And I have a second question, it's about the pillar. You were saying that you think it might have been done later.
Yeah, and again, I'm not sure, and listening to some of the builders here, you know, it's a tough call. It's one of these, it's like, something doesn't seem quite right about it, and I can't quite make it all work. I have, all I can say is I have a suspicion that it might be a replacement for the pillar.
You think it was made especially for this instrument?
I think so, yeah.
Well, then, why couldn't he do the proper tendon straight away?
That's
Or
a
she?
Or, yeah, that's a good question. Well, one thing is, the back of that harp has this big iron strap that I mentioned to you earlier, across the joint between the neck and sound box. And that's nailed in place, and that doesn't come off. And if you had to replace a four-pillar on a harp, you can't take the harp apart. You've got to somehow, you know, jiggle that or shrivel that new four-pillar in place with the harp still, with the sound box and the neck still together like this, and sort of, you know, held together with this strap that's not gonna flex. And so you've got to kind of work it
Is
in
it
there.
held with a nail or the nails?
There are 6 big and very long nails holding that iron strap in, and they've never been taken out. So when that was put on there, that was put on there.
When do you think that was put on? When do you think that strap was put on? Would
It-
that not have been maybe put on later?
Well, that's a good point. It could have
Yeah.
been. It could have been. Yeah, absolutely. It's, you know, it's definitely not original because there's decorative work underneath it. But yeah, it could have been done later. It was done. I think it was done. However, before the damage to the front end of the neck, and the front end of the neck is really badly twisted and cracked inside. You can't see it from the outside, but it's definitely, you can see it. And you can see that the four-pillar has also followed the neck,
And what
and
makes
it's twisted.
you think that it was that the pillar was replaced after the, just because I can't envision trying, there is quite a substantial tendon on both sides of the
Yeah.
pillar.
Yeah.
I cannot imagine trying to jiggle it in
Yeah, I
without
don't know.
taking the neck off.
Well, that's just it.
Impossible.
Yeah, that's just, I don't
There's
know.
no way
Impossible.
you
There's
get
no way you can do it.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, what do you guys think?
No, I would imagine that you have to
Well,
take the
given-
whole thing apart.
Given the size of the tendon and
Yeah.
the bottom and the foot of the neck into the sound box and the length of the tendons on each end of the pillar, there's no way.
No, you can't.
You
can't
can't
just
do
do
it.
it.
So what do you think? I mean,
Well, unless the neck was, the strap was attached together with the new pillar, maybe the whole thing can.
yeah,
Whatever, no,
yeah.
The neck, the other pillar.
Did it at
whole
the same
thing.
time, they could have done it at the same time.
But it would be impossible to do.
Yeah, and.
What if the parts of the harp were made by separate makers and a green part of wood and you've decorated it all up and it's shrunk up a certain way and you put it together and it doesn't quite fit, but
That's
Where you
possible,
are.
that's
Yeah.
very much
Is
possible.
this connected to the split in the pillar, and is it distorted after it was decorated?
I don't know. The twisting of the four-pillar is at the ends, and unfortunately, I don't have an image to show you, but what has happened is when the front end, when the end of the neck, that's the front end away from the sound box, when that split inside, it became a little bit floppy. But what also happened is the four-pillar compressed the wood on both sides of that mortise as it twisted and pushed downward and outward. And the tendon at the bottom end is also twisted. And I'm not sure if, I don't think that the split in the midsection, which I think that's what you're referring to, I think that's separate. That's actually just checking from the wood drying, because it's a piece.
You don't think it would make it make it bend more or less as it does?
Well, it could, I suppose it could, I don't know.
It would seem obvious, wouldn't it, that
Yeah,
if
I
it's split
expect it to
open,
move a
then the
little.
bend.
I'd expect it to move a little, but I wouldn't have thought there's enough tension on the Queen Mary to cause it to actually open up too much or have too much place.
What do you mean, enough tension on the Queen Mary?
I think there's, you know, there's a fair amount of tension on the frame, but I don't think there's enough there, given how substantial the pillar is, to cause that check to open up a heck of a lot, or move that much.
I'm not sure I understand.
So what I was seeing was just, aside from the split in the middle, just the tenons themselves got twisted. And you know, you can see, like the tenon at the bottom, it's narrower than the mortise. And so as the whole four pillar, imagine, you know, the front of the neck, it's got like a broken wrist, and so it did this, the front end of the neck, and it dragged the four pillar with it. And you can see the bottom end is, the whole thing is done this. And you can see the tenon had twisted this way inside the mortise. It did this, and you can see where it's kind of compressed also when it hit the sides and it started to distort a little bit.
Can I ask another question in relation to that for the builders? And that is, if you had an old sound box with a neck with the mortises, how easy or hard is it to match that with a tenon?
It's very easy to match,
Okay.
very easy.
It's
That's why,
You can measure the inside of the tenon.
Absolutely, it's very easy to match, that's why it's like.
Yeah, that's what I'm asking.
Why would you bother?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point because the Lamont harp, I didn't mention this, but the Lamont harp four pillar, it's in two pieces, and the bottom half looks like it was a repair. And the tenon in the bottom half of the Lamont harp four pillar is totally the wrong size for that mortise. You can see where they had to like cut out, they had to shim the mortise. I mean, it's like completely not the right size. And the Lamont harp four pillar is, I'm beginning to think came from, I'm really starting to think, let me back up, I'm really starting to think for a number of reasons that the Lamont harp pieces were not all originally together. That might actually be a mashup. I don't know if mashup's the right word. It's a put together, coupled together instrument. That, I think that four pillar, the top end of the four pillar, the Lamont harp, the original tenon broke off through the string hole, through the tuning peg holes. And you can see it on the CT scans where it broke off, it sheared off like a postage stamp, you know, just perforated right through there. You see it's broken, and then it was then recut and shoved farther up, and then a new set of tuning pin holes were put through it. And I don't know, I thought, well, okay, they had it on the harp and it broke, and then they had to fix it and whatever. But then the bottom end, that tenon, it's totally the wrong size for that mortise. It's not even just like maybe a trank or maybe they left room. It's just completely, it's like too wide and too short, and it does not match that mortise at all. There's no way that was made for that mortise. It's totally the wrong size and shape. So that's really weird. Also, the tuning pins on that harp are a completely mismatched set. They're like 6 different, slightly different designs on the drive ends. Last year, the Montgomery set of tuning pins came to light, and this is a matched set of 24 Irish harp tuning pins that was found in a castle in the Welsh borders, and they're in mint condition. They're unused. They'd never been in a harp at all. And what looking at those was what sort of made the penny drop with me, and thinking, geez, if you're making a harp, would you put? It's like making a new shirt. Would you, if you're making a shirt, would you go to your button box and find 6 different buttons and put them on this shirt that you just made? If you're making a harp, it's a lot of work. Do you put on a mismatched set of tuning pins? The only thing is, you don't tend to lose tuning pins unless you take the strings off of the harp. And you don't take the strings off the harp unless it's not being used. So I'm really beginning to suspect that the Lamont harp had no strings on it for long enough that somebody then took away the tuning pins, because you can reuse those somewhere else. It's like an old junk car. You strip it for parts. And tuning pins are easy to take off and use somewhere else, and they're valuable and nice. And I'm really beginning to suspect that at some point in its life, the Lama harp had no strings and no tuning pins. At least that neck didn't. And then at some point, somebody said, let's refurbish this. Well, let's find some tuning pins that fit. And they have to cobble together a set of tuning pins. And if you're refurbishing some old thing, you're not going to go to, at least I think, you can disagree, you're not going to go to all the expense of making a nice new set of tuning pins if you're just cobbling together an old clunker. That's the new name for this harp, the old clunker. You would get used ones if you're just cobbling it together. And that's, I'm really beginning to think, gee, maybe that harp was cobbled together in the 17th century. And then maybe it's parts of older harps. Sound box, neck, and floor pillow.
Because am I right in remembering, I'm not so familiar with what I'm on, but that's also the string shoes on the soundboard, 2 or 3 different types?
There's 2 different ones. There's most of them are this one ornate type in the middle. And then there's 3, I think it's 3 at the bottom and 2 at the top that are different. And I checked, and it's not like they were replaced. There's no old nail holes. Like at first you think, oh, well, maybe they had to replace them. No, there's no, because they have a different nail pattern. So, yeah, you're right. And also, there's 31 tuning pin holes in the cheek band and 32 string holes in the sound box. There's a 32nd tuning pin hole that looks like it's been added in below the cheek band. Okay? Now, for the longest time, people thought, well, maybe, like the Trinity harp, maybe there used to be another tuning pin underneath that cap, and something happened, but I looked on that. I can see underneath the cap on the CT scans, and it doesn't look like it. Yeah, Andrew.
I'd just like to say that on this question of sort of unmatching parts and unmatching tuning pins, I have owned a harp made by somebody, let's not use names, in Scotland, which had 3 different kinds of tuning pin.
All right, okay.
And I still own a harp made by somebody in Scotland, which is made from 3 different bits at roughly the same time, but originally intended for 3 different instruments.
Oh, okay. All right, so, okay, great. So what happened?
Well, I think with 3 different, do you have, the pins are different in the diameter?
Yeah, it needed a very special, I no longer own that harp, but it needed a very special 3-cornered tuning key with 3 different diameter holes on the end, and every time you went to tune those, you had to remember which end you were trying to use.
Because I think in the beginning of this century, last century, it wasn't common practice to put 3 or 4 different sizes of the pins into the harps.
Yeah, no, this was not, let's say, a carefully designed thing. It was, we've run out of tuning pins today.
Well, so does it mean that it might have been a practice piece altogether?
I don't know. It's like, what is the way that the pins are different in terms of, like the decorative work on the drive-in is the different design. It's just, they're different decorative work on the drive-in. The drive-ins don't match.
I'd also like to say, although we're making fun of this, it doesn't mean that the Lamont didn't sound absolutely wonderful
Oh, no,
when
oh,
we're
yeah,
talking about
absolutely.
this.
It
Just,
does.
just
And
to
again,
clarify to
this
people.
is just speculation.
No, it's also, it can be, maybe it was the experimental model. They decided to make a bigger harp with a wider range, and okay, let's try this, this, and this. And because it's an experiment, they didn't want to go to the expense of making, and so they just took everything they had around,
Yeah,
and tried it out. That's an option.
Yeah, and the other thing is, I went back and I examined the string holes, and I have to say I'm pretty well convinced. There are no signs. There are very heavy signs. There are a lot of signs that of where the strings have been put through the string holes, except the very top hole and the very bottom hole. There's nothing. Even under high magnification, there's not a single scratch on those holes. They look like they were just put in there and never used. The only thing I can think is if they were so lightly strung, at some point that, you know, maybe when they were in use, the harp was very lightly strung and nothing left a mark. And later on, maybe the stringing was heavier, and that's what, yeah, go ahead.
Can you show us the inside of the Queen Mary soundbox again?
Yeah, sure. But anyway, yeah, so the Lama harp, where am I mean, what's it use well? I'll just click there. Yeah, so the first and the last number, string hole number 1 and string hole number 32 on the Lama harp, they look like they were never used. So that's something to ponder on.
Somebody was modifying to fit that role.
Oh, and the other thing I noticed inside the Lama harp, which I didn't mention, was you can see the scratches, especially under magnification. We're unanalyzing things. You can see the scratches from where.
We're forgetting all that you've told us.
It's sucking it back out of your head. You can see the scratches where, I don't know if you've watched Simon string harps or if you string your own, if you string it through the sound hole, not.
That'll do.
Oh,
Come too far.
if you string it through the sound hole, you've got your toggled string out here, and you've got your wire puller, and you pull it through, and you can see inside the sound box the scratch marks where someone has strung the harp through the sound hole, and also kind of fished around. And under magnification, there are a lot of scratch marks. I mean, a lot. Like,
Are you going to do a drawing of them and
Yeah,
show them?
yeah, not today, but yeah, the some of them, 2 of the sound holes had approximately 200 scratches a piece, and the other 2 had between 100 and 120 scratches a piece. Okay, that's a lot of string changes.
Well, it was breaking strings like that, I guess.
That's a lot. That's that's several hundred string changes. If each one of those, unless you make a lot of scratches for one string change, I guess. The other thing is, you could see where they were preferentially aiming towards the middle section of strings. You could see where the scratches aim. So there were fewer scratches towards the treble and the bass strings,
It's easier.
but they were preferentially aiming towards sort of the middle 3/4 of the harp, or middle 2/3 of the harp. The other thing is that little piece of vellum it comes up right close to one of the sound holes, and it's got a little dog ear. It's got a corner that's folded back. There are no scratches underneath the folded back part of the corner, but there are scratches on top of the vellum. That's really interesting. Now, I think that my theory, I think that harp at some point in its history was, and all these 3 old harps, that they were originally strung through the string holes. That you take the toggle, and if you use not a big fat wooden toggle, but like a metal toggle, you can push it through the string hole, not through the sound hole, and then it gets trapped. And you think about it, that's why toggles are toggles. That's how toggles work, is you push it through and it gets trapped. It's really easy to do. And one of the reasons I think that is the holes on these harps, the string holes, are much bigger than on your replicas. They're like 4 millimeters in diameter. That's huge. 4 millimeters in diameter. Or more, 4 to 5. They're big. You don't, if you're building a harp, and the builders can tell me, if you're building a harp, that string band, that's a vulnerable part. You don't make those holes any bigger than you have to. Why make them so big? Because that's going to make that weaker. The only reason I can think to make those holes that big is if you're pushing a toggle through them. So I'm wondering if at some point in these instrument slides, originally they were toggled through those holes, and then later on, people started restringing them through the sound holes. And is it because the strings were thicker and stiffer, and it's harder, you don't want to crimp the string? I don't know.
Maybe they started using wood toggles
Yeah.
because the metal was gone. Maybe it became, and possibly, not with the shoes on. They did, switching over to the metal strip down the center and small holes. equate with holes in the back of the heart. too.
Exactly, yeah. The later harps, in fact, have the little rosette. Some of them have like the sound hole has like a rosette in it. You can't string through the sound hole.
I've sprung through a rosette.
Well, you
Oh my
can't,
God,
but-
well, then, the top of that.
Well, the spaces are, they're bigger than, they're kind of surprising.
All right.
Yeah, you've got
We've
the
done
edges
it. I said,
of
all
the
right.
triangle.
Okay, all right. I believe you. Okay, I believe you.
Anyway, my question on here is
Oh, yeah.
the smudges around each peg hole.
Yes.
Are they toggle marks or is that varnish coming through?
It
Or
both. Yes to both. So what happened was when at some point in the 19th century, somebody said, let's put a coat of varnish on the outside, and it was, the conservator said, this was somebody in a hurry. This was somebody who was looking at his watch saying, when is it lunchtime? They just went, and it seeped in through the holes. And it was very, very hard for me to see the toggle marks. There are toggle marks there, but they're hard to see, first of all, because of the grooves in the wood, and also because of this darkness. Some of it's from toggles, and some of it's from varnish seeping through. In fact, you can see the big varnish strip right there. There was one other thing, did I mention the iron wire? I don't think I mentioned the iron wire. There, in the end of one of these little wooden pegs, not this one, but one of the other ones, there was a little, yeah, there was a little tiny piece of, it turns out it was iron. I reanalyzed it, and it was weak. So in the 19th century, when they strung this up, they must have put iron in the treble because
Oh, God, that worked horribly.
yeah. So anyway, yeah.
Great.
Yeah, good.
Come-
All right, sorry.
Can we continue the discussion over dinner?
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Can we thank Karen?
Thank you all for sitting. Oh my gosh, the timer is saying 2 hours and 15 minutes.
So under 3 hours.
Oh, there we go. Well, thank you all.
Thank you.
Always.